Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority's Board of Directors meeting. It is February 16th at 6:30 p.m. and we look forward to getting started. We do have a quorum. The first item on our agenda is to approve the agenda. Is there anyone who would like to make a motion?
So moved, Rich.
And seconded by Kyra. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Wonderful. That passed unanimously. Next on our agenda is public comment. Deb, is there anyone in there that's ready to make public comment? I don't see anybody in here. It looks like we do.
Robert Pulowski. And he's unmuted.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, Robert.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Robert Pulowski, representing the Regional Transit Authority Citizens Advisory Committee, calling in from Pontiac, Oakland County, but from Southgate, Wayne County. First off, I really would like to welcome in our new board member that is on the agenda tonight, Monica Ross-Williams. I'd like to welcome you first on our board and look forward to seeing all the wonderful work you do on just joining this board and being able to work with the agency in the coming months, but also to welcome our newest Deputy CEO for Operations, George Brooks. I look forward to seeing all the wonderful work you do in operations, but also to grow the system as well. We're bringing in a lot of new people to the system, and we're also making huge improvements to our future of AAATA. So we have a lot of things coming, and 2023 is off to a good start. But other than that, I don't really have much. I can't really stay for this entire meeting, but you guys are doing really well on your hiring efforts, and I'm really happy to see that you guys are able to pull out more buses than more agencies around this entire state. So really give yourselves a round of applause for that. The increase in public transit is there, and public transit is evolving, whether it's whether it's micro transit, paratransit, fixed route, it is growing, and especially in the Ann Arbor region. We have a lot ahead of us, and 2023 is going off to a good start. Again, thank you for your time and look forward to speaking with you guys next month. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Deb, is there anyone else online?
Nope, that was the last one.
All right, we're going to go ahead and close out public comment then and move on to 1.3 general announcements. We got usurped. I want to go ahead and welcome our newest board appointee from the Ypsilanti Township, Monica Ross-Williams. We're so glad to have you here with us tonight. And I was wondering if you would like the floor to say anything to your fellow board members of the public.
Okay, I think that's on. Thank you. Thank you for the warm welcome onto this board. And I look forward to getting to know each and every board member and beginning to work with them in order to improve transportation across our region. As for the public, thank you. And I hopefully will be able to do the due diligence required in order to serve you well in our region and also within the Ypsilanti Township community.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Monica. Matt, did you want to make an announcement now?
Sure. I'd like to welcome our latest staff member, Mr. George Brooks, our Deputy CEO of Operations. He's unfortunately running a little behind right now, so he's not here at the moment. Operations being what it is, I suspect I know how he's been detained, but I'm sure he'll be here a little bit later and we'll do a more formal introduction at that time.
That would be nice. We can certainly accommodate that. Next on our agenda is the consent agenda. Would someone like to move that into the record? Jesse is moving it in. Do I have a second?
Second, Rich.
By Rich. All in favor? Or is there any discussion on the consent agenda items that needs to happen? Seeing none, a vote of yay, raise your hand and say aye.
Aye.
Thank you so much, everyone. Now we're going to move on to policy monitoring and development. The first thing on our agenda is our task force updates. 3.1.1 is ownership linkage, and that is by Mr. Rich Chang.
Hello, just a quick verbal update on that. We have a draft email that would go out to the various township supervisors and administrators. It'll go directly just to those folks initially. For that draft, the next step is actually, I'm going to get in front of the governance committee. A question I actually have for the rest of the board is, for those that aren't part of the ownership linkage task force or the governance committee, do you actually want to see the drafts? Because if you do, then I can just send it to the finance and the service committee also for review. Otherwise, if you're okay with the last step being the governance committee, once I get their sign off, then I will get that sent out. But I'm actually, there's a timing on that, as I would like to give Kathleen and Matt some time to meet one-on-one with the administrators first before I send this out. So there is some time, but I just wanted to be as efficient as possible.
For me, thinking about this, I think the better way to proceed is finish the draft, send it on to governance, and then if will there be time for us to review it at the next board meeting? Because I think the board as a whole should review it and sign off on it and not just be a committee decision. Will we have that kind of time and leeway available?
Yeah, I mean, we can definitely chat about that, I guess. So
Okay.
yeah, let's figure that out.
I think that might be better since the board speaks with one voice. I don't want the governance committee to make a decision based on an ownership linkage committee referendum and then not involve the whole board. I think that would be the better way to proceed.
Got it.
Okay.
Yep, let's chat after.
Wonderful. Yes, I'm sorry, Monica.
Hi, Board Member Chain. It would be great to look at a draft. So if that can be sent, that would be good as well. So I studied the information.
If you want, Mr. Carpenter, I see that George has entered the room. Would you like to take a moment before is that George there? Would you like to go ahead and, I'm sorry.
So everyone, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Mr. George Brooks. He's just joined us originally from Philadelphia by way of Baltimore and Maryland. He comes to us most recently from the Maryland MTA, where he was responsible for heavy rail operations across the Baltimore area. George, would you like to say a few words? Come on up, approach the mic, make sure it's on.
Yep.
Yes.
Good evening, everybody. My name is George Brooks. As introduced, I come way of Philadelphia first. I spent 33 years at SEPTA, retired 3 years ago as Director of Vehicle Engineering and Maintenance. The last 3 years, I have been Chief of Operations for the subway system in Baltimore. And I'm happy to be here, and I look forward to serving the board and the community.
Welcome. Does
Any
anybody have?
questions?
Seeing no questions, thank you. Welcome.
All right, thank you.
All right, now we'll go back to business as usual, but I just didn't want to get that. Didn't want that to go by the wayside. I wanted to make sure that we all got a chance to say hello. Next on our agenda is 3.1.2, policy monitoring, and that is Mr. Mike Alaman.
Thank you. The task force met on the 2nd of February. We spent the entire meeting reviewing what is Appendix A to the policy manual. And Appendix A lists every one of the monitoring reports, all 28 of them. And it has several columns next to each that goes down and next to each of those policies. The important columns for one is the frequency of the reports. The second is the due date of each report. And the third is what body, such as a committee, for example, would be reviewing the results of a particular monitoring report and making recommendations for to the board at the following meeting. We went through every one of those items and made a preliminary decision on changing some of them in that report to different dates, different frequencies, and things like that. We did not have time to take that and put it into a form to bring it to the board. And furthermore, we wanted to review it one more time. So at our next board, in our next task force meeting, we will review what was put together preliminarily at the last meeting, and will be on one piece of paper, and go through it to see that we're comfortable with making the recommendations that were on there. I wouldn't be surprised if we decide that maybe some of the preliminary recommendations that we went through quite quickly, we might want to change a little bit. So, but anyway, our intention is then to finish our recommendation there in terms of that particular form and bring it to the full board at the March meeting. And if have a nice discussion of that. And our objective would be to see if it could be approved at the March board. So Kathleen, you're part of the committee. If you want to add anything to that, if not, you can certainly take over see if anybody would want to ask any questions.
I don't think I have anything to add. Kyra, would you like to add anything? Seeing no extra comments from the peanut gallery. Sorry, sometimes I feel like that way, Mike, because you do such a brilliant job of leading us. So thank you so much. Does anyone else have any questions for the committee, or are you satisfied with the report? All right, seeing none. Thank you so much, Mike. We appreciate you. Next on our agenda is 3.1.3 procurement contracts. On your agenda, it says Carpenter, but it will actually be Ms. Reed who will be supplying that information. Hi, Dina.
Thank you. Yes, this is an issue brief in your packet to let you know that there are a couple of contracts that are actually contracts that get approved and selected by the board as they sort of directly report to the board. Those two contracts are the contracts of legal services and the board governance consultant, and they're both up for renewal this year. What's in your packet is a timeline for when we expect those procurements to occur. Generally speaking, we'd like to have the legal services contract procured with a recommended completion date of June, and the board governance consultant to be selected and decided by September. So what we're looking for are board volunteers who want to participate on the task force to review and evaluate the vendors that apply or propose for these contracts. So we're looking to have volunteers selected sometime by the end of February for the legal services contract, and sometime in March, by the end of March, for the board governance contract. And they do overlap a little bit, as you can see through the two timelines that are provided. But there is a little bit of a difference in terms of the pace at which they'll go. So generally speaking, the legal services contract will start earlier and end earlier, and the governance consultant will start a little bit later and end a little bit later. So they're staggered a little, but there's a little bit of overlap. So if you would be open to considering that and provide feedback to us, if you're interested in participating on the evaluation committee, we would really appreciate that.
Thank you, Dina. Now, it's my understanding when we talked last month that we're looking for 2 for the legal and 3 for governance, and that staff, board members do not necessarily have to have a heavy background in legal and or governance, in that staff will be there to provide support and guidance through the whole process. So the board is not going to be making this decision out on a limb. You're actually going to have really good support in this decision-making process. So if you are interested, but you think, I don't really know anything about it, please consider putting your name in the hat.
Yeah, if I could add to that, our procurement department will lead the procurements. They're Michelle Whitlow is our manager of procurement. She'll be leading the procurement process. She'll be providing documents. She'll be providing the timelines, updates, meetings. We'll help set up meetings for the committee and things like that. So administratively as well, we're still going to assist the board in walking you through the process, providing you information about procurements, the type of procurement we're doing. We've already made a recommendation to the board on that, and that's also in your packet, that we think is most appropriate for this type of contract. And we'll provide materials along the way and receive all the materials. So the board, the task force itself, won't actually have to receive all the documents directly. We'll do that through procurement and then assist in the procurement process.
And for me, the reason that the board is become involved in this situation. Normally, we're not involved in procurements, but since the attorney and the governance coach report and work directly for the board, it's important that we are involved in this process. Mr. Carpenter?
Thank you. I just want to point out that Ms. Sims participated in selection of the legal counsel last time and she survived. So this is a positive sign and should be encouraging to all of you.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, the process was very easy. Michelle does a wonderful job of synthesizing the information for us. So when we went through the procurement for attorneys, I don't know, 5 years ago, we received packets from all of the law firms that are, have responded to the RFP, and we read through their materials, and then there's kind of a ranking system. To reiterate, you do not need a legal background to evaluate their materials. And it's kind of a fun process. The interview process is interesting. And again, Michelle helps us a lot. She does all of the heavy lifting, and we do the review and the interview process and make a decision. And it's very collaborative, but it's a good, I think it's a good experience to pick one or the other. I would volunteer for the legal services one if there is I assume my firm is going to respond to the RFP. So, we can talk about that later, but it's a good thing to participate in and see a different side of the organization that we're not usually privy to.
So we don't have to have an answer this evening, but what I'd like you to do is keep in mind that the deadline for trying to put the task force together with regards to the legal, we want that done by the end of February is the deadline we've been given. So if you could please get back with me either by email or by phone and let me know your interest, that would be absolutely wonderful. Yes, Rich.
Can we get a reminder in email just about that?
Of course.
Okay, thanks.
I will. And then, of course, the other task force will have the deadline of the end of March. So that would be great. Was there anything else you needed to share, Dina? Was that everything?
That's everything. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Next on our agenda, 3.2, recommended changes to external relations policy. I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Chair. So the service committee took one final look, I hope a final look at the proposed changes to the what was the external relations, or what it currently is, the external relations policy. Ms. Rose Mercier, our governance coach, I think provided a great little summary of what the proposed changes are. I'm hoping that everyone had the chance to go through it. If not, I'm happy to go through it. But if you look at the first page on page 20 of your packet, it starts talking about what each of the individual changes are, where those policies are getting moved. So we're not having the extra, most of what like the meat of current policy 2.9 is being moved to current policy 2.7, the protection of assets, since we are viewing our external relationships as an asset. And then at the end, after we kind of go through all of the changes individually, I will be looking to propose on page 23 that we adopt the changes kind of rather than trying to do a series of motions for each individual policy. We're just going to say this is the proposal will be this is the entire new policy 2.7. And like I said, yeah, I guess at this point, I'm going to, I don't want to take up too much time if it's not worthwhile going through each individual change.
Well, first of all, I went through this very thoroughly, and the work that you all did was Herculean. So I want to say thank you for that very much. It's very well written, the document, in terms of understanding what is moving where. The only question I had was with regards to 2.9 itself and 2.91 and 2.92, it says that they're written as management prescriptions, not executive limitations. So I'm assuming that things like, wait, let me see. land development, our first mile consideration, whether internally or outside the decision makers, that those would be found else. I didn't see where those were put. Are we saying that there's language somewhere else within the policy that addresses that? And I'm just missing that. But other than that, everything else within the policy that will, I think the first motion would be to actually delete all of 2.9. And then the motion to accept 2.7. But if you could tell me what we did with those first three ones, because I'm just not seeing it.
2.91 and 2.92 are, the service committee determined to be management prescriptions. We agreed with Rose Mercier on that. And so the opportunities for collaboration for the community benefit, that's not really our place to say. If the CEO manages to find a way to achieve our ends without collaboration for the community, or without collaboration with the community, power to him. But that's not our place to tell him whether or not that's the method he has to use. And also the opportunities to promote multimodal solutions. Again, that is a means prescription. That's not our place as the board to tell him how to do his job. So.
Thank you for clarifying. I think where I was getting hooked up was under proposed amendment where it talks about that it more aligns under asset protection, but then I didn't see where they fell. But what you're saying makes utter sense in that we don't want to be prescriptive and meansy, and that's exactly what these are, and we're trying to avoid that. So
Yeah.
thank you for clarifying.
I think maybe like the idea, like the philosophy behind the intention behind 2.9 and 2.2 is expressed through the protection of assets, and by the things that we've moved over from 2.9 into 2.7 and revised is still expressing that same ethic. It's just now more in line with policy governance.
Fantastic. Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Miller with regards to the document here? Or would we like to someone make a motion and vote on it, or would we like to have discussion?
I want to echo Kathleen saying this was a lot of work. It's always hard to revise our policies, and I think 2.7 is a good revision, so I'd be ready to vote on it. So we're getting rid of 2.9 entirely? Okay, I will move to delete policy 2.9 from our policy governance manual.
Kyra has put a motion on the floor to delete 2.9. Would someone like to second?
Second, Rich.
Seconded by Rich. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, now 2.9 is deleted and we can move on to accepting the 2.7 protection of asset with all of its new language. Would someone like to make a motion to put that into the record? Simi?
I'll make a motion to accept 2.7 is written in attachment 3.
Do I have a second?
Second, Chris.
Seconded by Chris. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Mike, did you get a chance to vote?
Yes, aye.
Oh, thank you so much, sir. Then that passed unanimously. Thank you so much. And again, thank you to the service committee for doing a really great job. And that effort was just amazing. So thank you again.
If I could, I just
Oh, of
want
course.
to again say the same thing. I really appreciate all the work that the service committee did on this. This is probably the largest undertaking of policy rewriting the largest undertaking in certainly a long time. So I really appreciate all the time that everyone spent on it. I really appreciate all the work that Rose Mercier put into helping us through it. So thank you all very much.
Okay, moving on. We are at 3.3 construction policy updates, and that is Mr. Alamay.
Yes, if people have seen in the board package, there is a problem identified with our construction policy, specifically 2.1.1, requires the board approval before the staff can apply for a grant or other kinds of funding. However, there can be, and there has been, a situation where there was inadequate time between hearing of the grant opportunity and submitting the grant application. So we wanted to remedy that situation. And the Finance Committee was tasked with looking into that, seeing if we could come up with a recommendation. So at our last meeting, we did review that and came up, I think, with a good conceptual idea about it. We didn't have time to draft the actual language on it, so it's not in front of you today, but we intend in our next meeting to finalize that language and present it to the March board. But basically the concept is where there is inadequate time to really get board approval, there is some provisions in our bylaws, in our policies specifically addressing emergency situations that for the executive committee. Now, you may not have heard of the executive committee because I don't think we've ever met. We haven't had to face any emergency situations. But one provision in there allows for emergencies, situations where the executive committee could approve something that would normally go to the board. We want to clarify and with some language in there that to specifically and very distinctly and clearly define the situation like I just described, where there was inadequate time to apply for a grant. So that there would be a slight modification to policy 211, but also the executive committee policy is in 3.7.2. And we would want to specify again that the executive committee would have the ability to approve in an emergency situation, things like grant applications where there wasn't time for the board to meet. And certainly anything approved by the executive committee would be very quickly, notification would go to the board. But again, we don't have the language tonight. We plan to have the language at the next board meeting, and we can discuss it at that time. And things go well, approve that change. Those two changes, they are really not major changes in wording.
Thank you, Mike. I actually have a question. So for those who may not have been in their policy manual in a while, the executive committee is it's not really one I think that we've put into play, at least in the time that I've been on the board, but the membership is the chair, the treasurer, the secretary, and it's chaired by the board chair, not, I don't see where it allows for any other members. It's just them. My question to you, Mike, is under 3.7.2, item B, it says task force appointments, but it also says one-off issues and emergent issues. Are we thinking that because the situation like with the earmark that became available that was never really an option for almost 10 years, that we would not consider that a one-off, that we would want to put that in as language to sort of cover the fact that it may be coming back on a more permanent basis? Is that what the committee is thinking, that why language would need to be changed under 3.7.2?
Yeah, we discussed the fact that it could be interpreted to include things like what we're talking about, and specifically to refresh people's memory. We had the opportunity to apply for an earmark that was sponsored by Congresswoman Debbie Dingell for the YTC enhancements, and we did apply and actually got a $7 million grant out of that. So that was a great opportunity, but we would feel a lot more comfortable to specifically mention this particular kind of a thing in the executive committee policy so that, I mean, we certainly don't want to try to interpret that policy broadly, because we think it should only be used in very restricted situations. Although there was some discussion that it probably would fit within there without any modifications, but we really wanted to specifically identify this. We think that could be happening again in the future. And we wanted to make that very clear that that was allowed for the executive committee under those circumstances.
That sounds really good. Does anybody have any questions for Mike? Yes, Monica.
Okay, I guess I'm trying to understand specifically what type of situations that would go to the executive committee before coming to the board. I know with some grants that was talked about, maybe some earmarks. Is it specific earmarks? Is it specific grants?
Now, the way, the only thing that's occurred so far was an earmark opportunity that came up. It was really a grant opportunity. And we would only want that to apply in cases where there was inadequate time between when the staff heard of the opportunity and the time it had to be submitted. If there wasn't a board meeting that fell in between, then and only then would the executive committee approve it. And we wanted to spell that out very clearly in the policy so that wouldn't be in the future, if there might be some people who wanted to more broadly interpret the powers of the executive committee. We certainly don't want to have any power usurped from the board, except if it's necessary in an emergency. And this has been the only time that something has come up like that.
And then maybe I can provide a bit more context.
Yeah, thank
although
you.
we are getting a little bit of feedback on some of the mics. Okay, they're on it. Normally, grant applications are scheduled well in advance, and we know when they're coming, and there's no concerns coming to the board first. And again, this only applies to construction projects because it's under the construction policy. The scheduled grant applications, and we'll be talking about one tonight with respect to propulsion. We know those dates. We know they're coming. Earmarks suddenly came back a couple of years ago. That those were not being done when the construction policy was written just before the pandemic. And it did create some very tight timelines. The $7 million funding request, we don't call them earmarks anymore, funding request that Congresswoman Dingell did secure for us began with an earmark request that Dina's group pushed forward from a planning project that we had. But we found out we were going to be able to make the earmark request the day of a board meeting, I think, or the next day, and the deadline was 2 weeks later. So either call some sort of emergency board meeting, or what do you do? And we had no practice, policy, procedure for that eventuality. So we kind of went ahead and put it in because it was a project the board had expressed a lot of support for, kind of approval in principle. But I did feel like staff were getting kind of out ahead of the board. I wasn't too comfortable with that. So Mike's group is trying to find a way to make sure, should we be in that situation again, and earmarks do appear to be a thing. And to the extent we can plan for them, we will. And I'm hopeful in our budgeting process and our capital planning process, we might be able to leverage those to get your approval at a much earlier date so that this doesn't become an issue. But should we get caught again, this is kind of a way for the board, or at least a part of the board, the senior most part of the board, to be able to weigh in on something, and we can still proceed rather than miss the opportunity altogether or put staff in a spot where maybe we're breaking a rule. That was the intent.
Did you have any further questions, Monica?
Not at this time.
Very good question, though. Any other questions or concerns, or? All right, well, thank you so much for that, Mike. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to hearing what your recommendations are come March. Next on our agenda is 3.4 board meeting agenda changes, and that is Mr. Rich Chang.
Hi, everyone. I know this is the most exciting part of today's board meeting, so I'm glad I get to be a part of this. This is really just for us to discuss and maybe even improve some proposed updates to the agenda templates. And it's really regarding like the main section. So you should have like a separate printout at your seat. It's like agenda item 3.4 sample document. Has a word sample all and a watermark on there. And what this is really around is to really pull our agenda more in line with what we as a board really, how we should really operate under policy governance, right? So the main things that we're responsible for as a board is ownership linkage, monitoring, and policy. And so what we did here was actually, you'll see sections 3, 4, and 5, and actually 6 is one that we also added on there regarding like board education / discussion. And so what we did with this was actually pull the existing today's board agenda and then kind of add it or overlay it onto this new agenda template. And one thing to note is like the main sections, right? So the top level numbers of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, those would pretty much stay. And then the sub numbers would just be flexible, however it's needed. And if it's not needed, then we aren't going to discuss it at a particular board meeting. But in general, I don't see like, for instance, ownership linkage, monitoring policy ever really going away, but just to know that the subcategories are very flexible for us to do. I did goof up a little bit in the info type, like I forgot a few of these, but I don't think that matters in this particular case. But yeah, I mean, I just wanted to get this in front of you and see if this is something that you're aligned with, that you think we should start using moving forward. Definitely open for discussion around this too.
To share with the board, Rich has been working with the governance committee on this, I believe since maybe December actually. And at our last governance meeting, if I'm correct, Mike and Jesse, we determined that we felt very comfortable with this proposal and we asked Rich to provide it to all of you for your input and feedback. We'd be very interested in hearing if you have any changes. I would also like to mention that as I reviewed the changes that Rich has proposed, these very much align with sample agendas that are in the John Carver model. To be honest, the board has been struggling with, and we are getting up to speed with ownership linkage, and that should be like one of our primary functionings. And so to have it take such a prominent view at the beginning of the agenda, right after the consent agenda, why that's important is because ownership linkage and how we hear from our moral and legal owners will also help drive conversation about monitoring policy, board education, and those sort of things. So I think that was also the reason for making it such a prominent agenda item. I just wanted to add that. Does anybody have any questions for Rich? If there are not any questions for this evening, my question would be, if we like this sample, do we feel comfortable enough moving it forward down the line and actually making a motion and accepting it? Or would the board want to entertain one more month to have more time to reflect and look and give feedback at the next meeting? Yes, Amy.
I do. I think I'm comfortable. I'd be comfortable moving forward with this tonight, but another option might be, could we move to try this temporarily? Like next month, we try it and make a decision after that. But I think the structure makes a lot of sense. I've been in favor of it since early on.
Anybody else? Yes, Monica.
Just a general question. What constituted the change in the agenda, or other words, the structure of the agenda? What constituted that change?
Do you mean like what prompted it, or so it's really around the structure of policy governance from a board level. So there's 3 main functions that the board, I guess, serves or does in policy governance, and that is really around ownership linkage. That's like how they interact with their constituents, so primarily legal and moral owners. Then the part is then to take that input and feedbacks and discussions that we have with them, and from there, utilize that in conjunction with monitoring around policy. So policy is what we use to direct Matt for how he is kind of like the guardrails of, okay, here's the goals that the board is set based on ends. Like these are like what we want the results. And then he has the guardrails based on the policies as to how he achieves those particular ends. And so that's why the order is pretty specific, where the ownership linkage is like, we as a board, what do we hear? How do the discussions go with our constituents? And from there, how does that in conjunction with the monitoring reports that we do mirror or match up with the policies? And if they don't, then we have to make changes. So that's why those main 3 sections were there. And the board's education and discussion was really around making the board meetings actually a bit more us than the staff. Because the way that the current agenda, I felt like it was very much more a lot of just reporting out from the staff. And there was really no delineation as to where we're as a group actually running a lot of discussions. So that was the basis of that.
Yeah, to be honest, what I think this achieves is it helps us to be more forward thinking rather than backward thinking. Although looking at the past is very important, right? We have to be able to look to see where we were, so we don't either make those same mistakes or see where we were that went well, and how do we continue those things in the future. So I really appreciate this. Simi, I sort of kind of heard maybe a possible motion. You gave 2 different ideas, and I'm wondering, do we want to, since there's not a lot of discussion happening on this, does someone want to make a formal motion and see if it flies with regards to accepting this tonight? Or does somebody want to make a formal motion that we put it off until, or not, that would have to be formal, but that we put it off until March? I'm happy with either way. Mike Alamang would like to weigh in. I'm sorry, Mike, I cannot see your yellow hand.
Okay. Yeah, I really compliment Rich for developing this proposal. He took that on him. Was not assigned it. He just thought that would be a good idea. And I think it's a great idea. And I would feel comfortable with adopting it. I mean, we could always revise it later. So I would like to move that we accept Rich's proposal for a new type of agenda.
So we have a motion on the floor by Mike to accept the agenda item 3.4 as our new agenda template. And I'm wondering if there's a second on the floor. Seconded by Jesse. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
That passed unanimously. Good work. Thank you so much, Rich, for your effort on this. We really appreciate it. Next on our agenda is our ends monitoring report, and that is Mr. Carpenter.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. I'm going to provide you with your ends monitoring report. It begins on page 28 of your packet. And just a little bit of context, because we have some new faces on the board and on the staff. This is the first monitoring report for some folks. Perhaps the board's most important policies are your ends. Those are your strategic goals. Those are the outcomes that you direct the organization to strive to achieve every year. The monitoring reports that we provide are interpretations of exactly what does that mean, and here's some evidence about how well we've done. You accept them to varying degrees, and you've had a lot of discussion recently about how the gradations of how you do that. So what I'll start here, and I'll make a brief presentation. I'll hit the highlights and then open it up for questions. This is not the first time you've seen this particular report. We first presented it to the board last month as an introduction, just oriented you to the document. We also had opportunities at committee meetings. Honestly, we didn't get a whole lot of questions, but there's some really good feedback in the board surveys, and I hope you've had a chance to look at your peers and colleagues' comments in the back, because I think that's really where the discussion for you will go after I've done my synopsis. So in terms of strategic, how well have we done? I direct you to page 29, which is this very colorful stoplight sort of assessment. Generally, I am reporting partial compliance. Many areas are green and doing well. We have a few areas that are yellow and one area that's blue. And I want to quickly start with that, hit those, and then move on. So the blue one is the most interesting one. That comes from a change in the evidence that we wanted to provide. One of the most important things you asked me to do is to increase ridership or increase the proportion of residents or people in the community who are using public transit. The market share, the term for that in a transportation context is called mode share. What is the mode share of public transit? Mode share shows up in two cases in this report. One is under labor mobility, which is 131. But that's specific to commuting mode share. That's commuting to work, which makes it very appropriate in the context of the labor mobility goal that you give us. It's literally commuting to work. We are directly measuring people going to work. So that makes a lot of sense. The problem has been for 121 that we have historically tried to use that exact same measure here for a different goal. 121 is not labor mobility, it's more general. Public transportation options are increasingly chosen over use of a personal car. That's a broader definition. That's not just going to work, that's everything. But the best data we had was the same mode share number. All that mode share number comes from SEMCOG. They're the regional planning body for the greater Detroit Ann Arbor area. And they run what's called a forecasting model, which is a computer simulation of all of the transportation systems in the area. It's a very impressive thing. But it only measures travel to work in this respect. It does not measure overall mode share. So in reviewing it this year, Rosa and I said, you know, we really don't feel that this piece of evidence is cutting it. It does measure mode share. Perhaps it's a reasonable proxy, but it's measuring the wrong thing. And we're repeating ourselves in the report. We would literally put the same graph in twice in last year's report. So this year we said, you know, let's just call it what it is. It's not a good piece of evidence. It's not good enough for us. And if that means we have to report to the board that it's incomplete on this particular measure, so be it. So that's what we've done here. And I'm reporting in the compliance timeline that we think we have a bead on a better piece of data. We'd like to come back to you within 6 months on what that looks like. Rosa and I subsequently, was it just like last week or a week before? Last week, she and I went downtown Detroit, my old stomping grounds, met with the folks at SEMCOG. They actually do have a completely different data system that we might be able to use. It's fascinating. It is aggregated cell phone data. Companies can collect our aggregated information of where your cell phone is traveling. It's a little creepy. Okay, this is a little creepy. But it is then completely aggregated and rendered anonymous. So you can't tell whose it is. And then they can sell this to organizations like SEMCOG. SEMCOG can then mine that data to give us much more precise information about things like mode share. This is nice because the mode share data is also a little out of date. Sometimes it's based on data that was collected 3 years ago. And it's also an extrapolation and an estimate. So it's the best thing we've had until recently. And it's still a very good piece of data. But the new data source may be able to answer 121 much better in that it can tell us all trips, not just commuting to work, but everybody's trips, which is, again, a little creepy. But we don't have access to any personal information in there. It's a very aggregated, rolled up sort of thing. So I'm hopeful. Rosa's on it. She's working with the SEMCOG folks to get access to this data. Apparently it's free for us. That's cool. We're going to get back to you if you're okay on this one and come back to you with a sort of an updated report as soon as we've been able to sort of get our heads around how that works. So an example perhaps of staff looking at our own work and saying, we can do better. So that's 121. You don't get many blue squares. I wanted to talk about that. The rest of the report is yellow because of that blue square or the following yellow points. 112 is yellow for partial compliance, essentially because we haven't completed transitioning all bus stops to wheelchair accessibility. I may have set the bar very high for myself there. I didn't say we make good progress every year. which we have been, I said, we're finished. So until we're finished, I'm going to have to keep reporting partial compliance. And I may set myself up there with that one. So that's on me. 1, 2, 3, public transportation options produce conditions favorable to more compact and walkable land development. Our role in that is providing high frequency bus service. That's a function of the long range plan. We have set goals for ourselves here that we will increase the frequency of certain bus services on certain main corridors. We haven't accomplished that yet because that's a step in the long range plan that's a couple of years out. So that's why that's partially compliant. 1, 2, 4, relevant public policy is transit supportive. Again, I set a very high bar that every community has a transit oriented or transit supportive land use development framework. Ann Arbor does, and it's actually going very well. Their T1 zoning is being rolled out in quite a few areas in the city. But we have not had any ability to, we haven't even had time to talk to Ypsilanti or Ypsilanti Township about this. So that's in the future. And the other point here was bus lanes on highways. And we, again, have not had a chance to talk to MDOT, and that's a bandwidth issue, but partial compliance on those. And then labor mobility 131. This is an important one. And I actually would like to ask you to flip to page 49 in your packet. It looks like this. These are some of those useful commuting mode share graphs that do come from SEMCOG. So I'm reporting partial compliance here because our goal was it's going to increase. We're still dealing with the hangover from the pandemic. Ridership is rebounding, but it's not rebounding as fast. People are traveling in different ways. So this one's still kind of in flux. It actually decreased in Ann Arbor and increased in the city of Ypsilanti. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. That's why I'm reporting as partial compliance. But the thing I like about these graphs that I think is still worth a little bit of bragging about is you can see Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti are some of the highest mode share communities in Southeast Michigan. Historically, the only one that has been higher than us has been Highland Park. And I think that's because they're very transit reliant and they're right on Woodward Avenue. They have a high degree of transit service there. So that's why that one is being reported as partially compliant. Again, I do think there's a timeline for compliance on the ridership at the front of the report, and the mode share will follow that. As we recover from the pandemic, I do think things will begin to sort themselves out. There's no question that we've kind of entered a new world in terms of commuting. A lot of people staying home. That's something, it's still evolving, but it seems to be evolving in a particular way now. I feel more comfortable that we could make some steps to deal with it, but still kind of a moving target. Moving along, page 55 in your packet, multicolored table. This just shows you the historic trends of compliance in these areas, generally getting better. There's no red this year, so compliance is fairly good. Not perfect, we'll get there, but I think making moves in the right direction. And then finally, starting on page 57, you have your own responses to the survey. And pretty good stuff in here, I think. Generally speaking, there's some definitely some critical thinking going on. I'll leave that to you folks to discuss. But generally supportive. I didn't see anything in here that sort of said there was a major problem with the interpretations or the evidence. There was one caveat I wanted to clarify on page 60. In the board response, there was a comment in the middle of page 60 about policies 111 and 112. The board needs to discuss because they're only fixed route focused. I'm not sure that's accurate. So 111. One 112 is in largely focused on ADA paratransit related services. There's a lot going on there about paratransit, but the commenter is correct about 111, which has to do with the Fair Deal program for low income residents. I believe that only applies to the fixed route service. I don't know that that applies to paratransit. And there are reasons for that. Paratransit is a much more expensive service. But I'd have to double check on that one and sort of get back to you as a clarification about whether that applies. Yeah, okay. So other than that, Madam Chair, that's the report in a nutshell. Happy to answer questions. I have suggested perhaps this would be suitable as a B or under the old system in compliance, except for items noted. You do have a new reckoning system there. Yeah, it's still a B, actually. Demonstrates compliance with the interpretation except for stated non-compliance. But I will, of course, defer to the board to your judgment on this report. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carpenter, for such a thorough report and for your candor and your reasoning behind why you chose to mark yourself down in some areas. Yeah, in some ways, I think you might be a little bit too hard on yourself as a wheelchair user. I do know that there are just places where there aren't sidewalks. So you can't put in a pad or anything because there's no sidewalk adjacent to it. So we understand that conundrum. And I appreciate that you have set the bar so high, because then that also gives me hope that in my lifetime that will happen, that we're going to be able to make it happen for everyone, because it's very important. So with this report being given by the CEO, does anyone have any questions or comments about the report? Go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, so thanks for the, I know this is a massive report, not just for the board to go through, but for the staff to compile and get all that data. I was actually the one that had a couple of those comments on page, what was that, 60? So the one around 111 and 112, I view this more as something for us as a board to discuss, because I marked it as compliant, because as is, I viewed it as compliant. But the question I have for the board is, what do we consider affordable, and who do we consider those, I guess that terminology to? So for instance, with 111, it talks about fixed route service. And that's why I was saying, like, well, in reality, and I understand, like, it costs the ride more to provide those additional services, but I don't think it's, well, I guess that's for us to decide, right? Is that fair to say that because it costs us more as an agency to provide those services, we have to pass those directly on to the users that are benefiting from that? And so that was why I mentioned, like, maybe we need to not just say that it's only fixed ride focused, but also should A ride and gold ride be part of the consideration for that? And then the other one that I brought up was regarding 124, suggesting we split out C, that Michigan Department of Transportation allows dedicated bus lines or HOV lanes on local streets and state highways to be a sub policy. Because I think the way it is right now, like, that is not going to be compliant for 5 to 10 years. I mean, beyond some of our tenure, even on this board. And I think that actually overshadows otherwise the A, zoning regulations, and B, propulsion densities in that meantime. So those are just the two things I thought maybe we should discuss.
Those are very good points, Rich. Does anybody want to build on that? Yes, Monica.
So I just want to make sure I'm reading this correctly as it relates to, I think it's under evidence, under policy 111, second paragraph, particularly second sentence says that eligibility up to the program is determined by being able to present Medicaid card, which is linked to income as described below, which I'm assuming that's below. And it says, and with a valid state ID. Okay, I'm coming back to the Medicaid. So basically, I don't know if a lot of people know that winding process is beginning to take place. So some people that may have been eligible for Medicaid in the past may not be eligible for Medicaid pretty soon going forward. So that was my question, particularly, is there any other way that they could show that they are, income eligible? Like, for instance, maybe, I don't know, a tax return or something of that nature.
Thank you. Yeah, these fair discount programs when the subsidy is well targeted, it's targeted to the intended audience. And if it's intended to help alleviate a low income situation, being able to demonstrate a low income situation is great. If you have a subsidy, for example, that everyone who's a senior gets to ride for free, that can benefit a millionaire who happens to be riding the bus. So it's kind of a unfocused subsidy, if you will. So means testing or providing some sort of demonstration of your income is a common, and I would say increasingly common, way of focusing your subsidies to make sure they work. The Fair Deal program has been around for a long time and has used Medicaid as its means test proxy for income for a long time. Part of that is because it's been a reasonable way to tell. The other way is, frankly, this so that we don't have to administer any sort of means test. To provide a tax return, yes, can it be done? Absolutely. I've worked in places that have done that, but then you need people to do it, infrastructure to do it, and we then have access to people's personal information, which creates the risk of some sort of loss or violation down the road. So the way they set this program up, and I confess I don't know how long it's been doing this, we're essentially deferring to the federal government's Medicaid program to say, okay, if you say those folks qualify as low income, we'll take your word for it. If they qualify for Medicaid, just show us your card, you're done. That gets us out of all the messy business and costly business of administering a means test ourselves. Can it be done? Yes. Should we do it is another question.
So specifically, I guess my question is, I totally understand what you're saying. Is there any other methodology that could be used to determine outside of tax returns, maybe if they are Section 8 eligible? That's something that doesn't necessarily require showing personal information. So my only concern is that maybe some people that lose the eligibility because they may lose their Medicaid coming up shortly.
I'm sure there are other ways to do it, but it would take us some time to investigate that, find out which ones were workable, how we could have paid for them. One of the things that I want to avoid, frankly, is someone coming to the office and putting their T4 up or W-2 up to the receptionist. That's not the appropriate place for this. And other places where I've done this, it's been trained social workers, frankly, who've administered that and can interact correctly there. We're not well set up for that. We could investigate it. We can certainly ask around if that's of an interest just internally about what it would take, and I could report back to you. I could look into it. Yes.
Go ahead, Jesse.
I'm really glad this was brought up. This is something I brought up repeatedly. That I think it's also shown by a certain lack of evidence. You give what the low income population of the county is, and then you state what Medicaid eligibility is, but we don't know whether Medicaid is even reaching what proportion of the low income population is being reached by Medicaid. So the Medicaid eligibility falls a little bit short in terms of justifying whether or not the entire low income population of the county is being served.
There are, I think, some fair criticisms about maybe the evidence. I think is kind of I'm kind of wondering how these questions are couched in policy governance terms, whether it's a question of the interpretation or the evidence, or just a critique of the Fair Deal program itself. Yeah, there are imperfections in trying to measure and track a low-income population, or frankly, any population. You have to rely on data that's collected by the census, by Medicaid, by HUD, by 100 other organizations, and there's always methodological flaws or trade-offs that take place in those moments. if the board feels that the interpretation, which is sort of, here's the fair deal program, it's working, that program, that interpretation could use some work, I certainly go back and we'll do that. You know, Rosa and I had discussions along these lines, and we know that this is somewhat imperfect ourselves. So if you look on page 37, for example, we give you a very short table. It's intended to illustrate some degree of utilization or market penetration or how many people are using this. So you'll see that there are 5,690 fair deal registrants during the monitoring period. That's a lot. That's a lot of people. No doubt we're doing some good there. The low income population from the Census Bureau was almost 50,000 people. So we got a tenth of it, maybe a little better. 8.7% to be precise. Is that good? We actually kind of struggled to put that in context ourselves. As a market penetration or a market share, does that mean it's bad because more of the 48,000 people aren't using it? Or do most of those 48,000 people in our area live, you know, or traveling in a way where transit couldn't meet their needs anyway? We don't know. Based on this data, we don't know the answer to that question. So trying to unravel some of these things, if the board really feels, you know, that this interpretation needs work, we can put some more effort into it. You know, changes, you know, I wasn't aware of any sort of change to the Medicaid program. That's new. And I would be, there's a difference between changes to this interpretation and changes to the fair deal program. And what we can do here on the page and reporting to you is one thing. Changing the program and the impacts that would have, I'd have to be more cautious about that.
Go ahead, Rich.
So Monica, you're getting like a total crash course in policy governance tonight. So one of the things I think, what I'm hearing is four things, and it's really around, I think what we have to decide is it's a concept called board holism. So what that is basically saying, like, Matt and the staff won't operate basically on just like one individual board member's request. It's like us as a group asking them to do something. And I'm hearing four things coming from us. One is the proof mechanism for low income, right? So that's like Medicare or whatever, some kind of ID. Two was whether we should include TheRide and Gold as part of like the 1.1.1. Three was that 1.2.4 change around like just moving that one section C to another thing. And the fourth is what I hear, which a lot of discussion now is like around 1.1.1, the evidence that Matt presents to us as whether this is actually being met or not. And I think it's up to us now to kind of decide, like, do we want to tackle because two of them I think require staff involvement. So it of course will take their eye off other balls potentially, because I know they're pretty short staffed. But I guess do we have them look in all four? Do we want to take one? I don't know if we want to vote on each one.
For me, what I'm hearing is, because this is backward looking, we're looking at the last year, and historically, this evidence has always been what we've accepted. I think that's why the CEO, Matt, has done it the way he has done it. What I'm hearing is that we have changed our mind as a board, that we've gotten new evidence about the Medicaid and all of that. I propose that we look at it as a backward thinking and look at whether or not we accept the monitoring report. I don't know that I feel comfortable saying the evidence isn't rational, in that any reasonable person would say that that evidence is rational, especially when we've accepted it year after year. More what I'm hearing is the board needs to either look at the policy more closely and make changes so that the CEO has a chance to do that over the next year. But I'm also hearing what you also said, Rich, and what Matt has suggested, that on a staff level, they could look at, and see, this is meansy. This is where we're kind of getting into a little bit of a dog pile, by asking the CEO to look at that we're seeing a need that may not be being met within how fair deal cards are being done. This may need to be explored more, maybe at the service committee level with you and with staff, and have a deeper dive, because my concern is that I think it's wonderful that we've shared this. I think it's important that the CEO knows that, but I'm also concerned that we're teetering on telling the CEO exactly how to do and what to do. And I see Matt has his hand up first, Rich, so I'm going to go to Matt.
No, this is an interesting sort of brain twisting conversation. I feel like some of the at least two of those four things might be executive limitation material. So shall not offer a discount to fixed route riders without offering a commensurate discount to paratransit riders. Like that would be an executive limitation. That's not, I don't think that would be out of line, but it would kind of get at kind of what we're talking about. The Medicaid change, or how we use it, we have a policy treatment of the traveling public. That's where we say, don't collect any personal information you don't need, so that if we get hacked, we don't have anything to lose, basically. Maybe there's a policy there about don't allow anyone to lose eligibility due to a change in a federal program. Some of these things may, the discussion about the ends may trigger discussion about executive limitations. Either way, I get to Kathleen, to your point, it's not about what happened in the past, it's about the future.
Rich, go ahead.
Yeah, so actually I was definitely not suggesting that there's changes, or like right now 1.1.1, like I said, I voted that as compliance. This is more, like you said, to bring to the services committee or the appropriate committee to discuss these. Because in reality, like the 1.1.1, it just says people with economic challenges have affordable public transportation options. It doesn't actually, like, the interpretation is where the fixed route came in. And for me, I'm like, well, maybe we need to be a little more specific on that, because people with economic challenges aren't just people that use fixed routes. There's people that use TheRide, GoRide that have economic challenges. And so, yeah, like I'm suggesting that these are for future moving forward, that we bring up discussions for potential modifications.
I feel comfortable with that. Who was first? Go ahead, Jesse. Thank you, Monica.
Yeah, I think, I think there's kind of 2 points now that I'm thinking that, in terms of the way that we accept things, I think there's a question of whether or not the interpretation is not reasonable because it does not include our entire ridership, because it doesn't take into consideration the TheRide, the paratransit services. And then my issue that I brought up has to do with the evidence, is that I don't feel the evidence presented that Medicaid eligibility is providing all low-income resident. I don't find that Medicaid qualification is compelling evidence in of itself as it's being presented, that the low-income population is being served, because I see no evidence that says that Medicaid itself is reaching the low-income population. All this evidence tells me is that people receiving Medicaid are served by the discounted rate. But unless that can also be proved that the Medicaid population is equivalent to the low income population of our service area, I don't find that evidence compelling.
Yes, Monica.
Thank you. And the reason why I brought that up particularly and brought this up is because of number one is the unwinding process that has to do with post-pandemic. So a lot of people got Medicaid in the pandemic for various reasons. And a lot of those, not everyone, but about 200,000 in Michigan are subject to lose Medicaid in the unwinding process. The other reason I bring that up, particularly just to look at, is particularly for our, might as well say more elder population that are on the borderline, right? Medicaid has a borderline in regards to eligibility, especially for when you get, past the age of 65. And it's about $1,138. If you're, under that, yes. If you're over that, no. And so if you look and you think about it, as the cost of everything has went up, $1,138 is probably about the amount of people's, certain people's rent or lease payment. That's the reason why I brought that particular subject up, is because when I saw it, the first thing I was like, well, what about some people who may not be Medicaid eligible now, or may be losing Medicaid in the future? How are they going to be able to still be eligible for the fair deal? That was the first question that popped in my mind when I read that. So it's not necessarily, I guess.
Attention, please. The library will close in 15 minutes. The internet stations will automatically shut off at 7:55. Please make any final copies at this time and take all materials to be checked out to a self-check station or to the circulation desk by 7:55. Thank you.
Got it. So it may be more of a question of, this may be compliant, but looking at future policies as it relates to that subject matter of the fair deal, to try and make sure that we're looking at a, broader perspective, if that makes sense.
So Jesse brought up a concern with regards to evidence and interpretation. I have not heard anyone else share that same concern. Is there anyone else that shares that same concern? Do we want to explore that further, or do we accept a motion of B as in compliant and the non-compliance that the CEO has stated with his dates of getting that information back to us? Is that how we want to go? But if we all speak with one voice, we have one member who's raised this question, and I want to see if anyone else has that same concern, if we need to have further dialogue. Yes, Rich.
So I actually agree with what Jesse's saying. But I guess the thing that I always grapple with is like, do we want to have them look at something that now is in the past? Do we want to kind of adjust things so that at the next reports, we have more of the results and data? Because I think in the end, based on what Jesse's saying, this would be not compliance, but I'm also not sure if that is like what that in the end accomplishes, when in reality, what we want is probably better wording around the policy and then better evidence as a result, I think, from that better wording. Because I mean, this is a pretty impactful policy, and the fact that it's only like 9 words, it's a little too brief for how much weight this actually carries, especially in regards to the ridership that we serve. So I think I would just suggest that we revisit the policy.
What are your thoughts, Justin?
I don't know that I agree that there's an issue with the policy. I think what you've brought up and the issues that I identify are very much in terms of interpretation. That the policy, I think, was pretty clear and I honestly don't know off the top of my head how I'd want to change it. That people with economic challenges have affordable public transportation options, and I think there is a really good attempt at demonstrating that. I just think that there are a couple ways in which the interpretation and the evidence have fallen short. So I guess I don't personally think it's a policy issue. I think it really is for me, an issue of reasonable interpretation and reasonable evidence. Mm-hmm.
Does anybody want to initiate any further conversation on what Jesse has raised? At this point, Jesse, if you want to make a motion stating what you've just stated, and then we could take a vote on it and see if it passes or not, that may be the best way to handle this.
Are you proposing for the entire report? I feel like we've spent all this time talking about just policy 1.1. Are we just how?
Oh, I apologize. I thought that we had discussion on the entire report. I didn't know that there were other things. Are there other discussions on other parts of the report that we feel we want to bring forward at this time? Or is 1.11 the sticking point? Yes, Monica. Take your time.
One more question. On page 27 of 29, I think it was, that's policy 5.1. And it was in regards to the data. I know it says basically between September 13th, 2021 and January 2nd, 2022, a total of 600 interviews were conducted and respondents were asked their opinion. Okay, got you. So basically in that, if you look at the unfavorable mix, not sure, it's about 19% of that pie, a part of that pie. Which, you know, that my next question is more so of the aspect of what is basically, and this may be a futuristic question, if so, and if I can't ask it, that's okay. But what is being done in order to look at that 19% in order to change perception?
And if I could add to that, if Mr. Carpenter, if you could maybe share what industry standards might be to help put these numbers into a broader context.
So generally with monitoring reports, it's compliant or not, and there's if it's non-compliant, here's the deadline for when it will become compliant. You shouldn't be judging the monitoring report based on what am I doing to bring it into compliance. That's kind of getting into the means sorts of things. I'm happy to share that we are sort of pivoting our community relations department into be public affairs and communications. It's very much an intent to get out into the community a bit more. Even things embedded in the millage, like putting customer service agents at the YTC, I think are going to have noticeable impacts on this. I think the ownership linkage work and getting out there and talking with elected officials and constituents, I think all of those things together will have an effect. I'm frankly waiting until I can hire a manager of the public affairs area and have them detail exactly where we should shoot our bullets in this particular case. So there's a lot planned going on, but in the context of standards and comparisons, these are phenomenal numbers. 81% having a favorable or somewhat favorable. Those are really good numbers. These are drawn from telephone survey that was done last 2021 around Christmas time. And so statistically significant, random sample, all that sort of stuff. So there's no question about the validity in my mind of the data, but it's a very strong showing. Not saying we can't do better or that we shouldn't try, but I feel it's pretty compliant back to the policy in terms of do people see value in the ride here, regardless of whether they use it? I think it does.
Was that sufficient, Monica?
Yes, the first part was, thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Yes, Rich.
Sorry, I just have I have more procedural question then. Because like in the additional context question section on page 60, I guess, how do we handle requests such as like that first bullet point where someone asks to change public transportation options to public transportation operations? Like, I don't know, like, do we as a board take that as a task and someone tracks that we have to discuss it, or just, I don't know.
Looking at that, I'm thinking that, well, first of all, what we're dealing with right now is the monitoring report from the CEO. We're not looking at future policy and policy word changes. So, but to answer your question with regards to how does the board proceed with their work, I believe that we could send this to a committee to explore it a little bit further, that language, see if there is any traction on that to bring back to the board. It's a one-off sort of situation. I'm not sure what the difference between options and operations would be. And so I think if we can delve into it at the committee level a little bit more heartily and meatily, and then if there are still questions or concerns, bring it back to the full board. But that's just my opinion. I'm not the board.
Yeah, because I mean, that was just one example, because the reason why I brought it up is like the last one, like the suggestion I gave with like 1, 2, 4 of splitting out C, like I don't know the proper procedure, because I mean, in reality, it's compliant, or it meets, his interpretation was fine, but I had a suggestion that I don't know how to even bring that forward.
Yes.
Sorry, for what it's worth, I'm I'm working on an attempt at this is a heck of a policy to try and attempt this kind of motion for, but I'm kind of with, if the board agrees with you and me that 111 is that the interpretation is not reasonable,
Your
then
attention, please. The library will close in 5 minutes. If you have materials to check out, please go to a self-check station or to a circulation desk now. Thank you.
I think at that point, we would have to make a motion for C and then identify, basically sort all of the sub policies into 1, 2, 3, and 4. Because that's what this is, we need to identify which ones are in compliance. We need to identify which ones where the interpretation is not reasonable. Number 3 hasn't come up yet. And then number 4, we have to identify, yes, we agree with the CEO that these are not in compliance. So I'm working on it. So I guess that brings up the 2 big questions for me is, one, I'm not comfortable that everyone agrees with you and me on 1.1.1, but no one's saying anything. So I guess I am left to take the evidence of proof as evidence. But then I also want to make sure that we get to the others, because like there were a fair number of people who had disagreements with 1, 2 as well, and no one's brought that up yet. So before I make a motion, I want to make sure you have both of those bases covered.
Mr. Carpenter.
And to your point, Madam Chair, you may want to procedurally separate, how does the board feel about the monitoring report from, does the board want to tackle these policy changes? And that may be just a separate item from the monitoring report. Perfectly valid, but just separate.
And usually I think that's what we've done after we've taken a vote, when we've identified that the policy itself is flawed. We generally say, hey, kind of informally, we're going to recommend this to such and such a committee, right?
And Mike has his hand up.
Yes, one thing I did not mention when talking about the monitoring task force is, assuming that we have time at the next meeting, we were planning to talk about how to handle policy revisions. And so part of what we're talking about tonight are how do we go about potentially revising policies? And that is something that the policy monitoring task force is going to tackle, and I hope start it at our next meeting. And so maybe we could just put the burden on the task force in terms of coming up with a recommendation there and discuss this at some other time, because that's probably not what we want to spend time on tonight.
That was a pretty fair assumption, Mike. Thank you for bringing that up. Is anyone else in alignment with Jesse and Rich's proposal, or does somebody want to make a motion to accept it as B? And then if that fails, then we can go on to what Jesse wants to propose, or should we do it the opposite way and go into the weeds of making it C and see if that flies? This is new to me. We haven't really used this form before. This is our first month doing it. And on such a very large report, it seems to be proving challenging for us. I'm love to hear what everyone has, or what anyone has to say. Yes, Monica.
If I have it correct, and please make sure I understand what Rich and board member Rich and board member Jesse is saying. They're saying kind of break up the process into processes, right? Do I have it wrong or no? Okay, could you please explain what it is that you're specifically trying to do?
No, that's part of, oh, sorry, it's okay if I go, Jesse. Yeah, no, I mean, you're correct in that we do have 2 things we want to figure out, but the main one right now is the board in alignment that the interpretation of 1.1.1 actually does not meet our what we view as the actual interpretation of that. Because right now it's tagged as compliance, but we can always basically say like, no, it's not compliant. We can also say, no, we also don't agree with the interpretation.
If I have policy monitoring correct in my, or the policy manual, maybe the most expedient way to handle this board would be to say that we feel that 1.1.1 is non-compliant, make a motion, take a vote, and see how it falls out. And if it falls out that the most of the board feels that it is compliant, then we can then move on from this point. If the board then
Your
aligns.
attention, please. The library is now closed.
If the board aligns with Mr. Chang and Mr. Miller's interpretation that it is non-compliant, then we can then move on to C and then break it down from there. Is that an acceptable way of handling this conundrum? Yes, Rich. Jesse.
I think I would rather just put a motion on the table and see how it goes. Like, and if there's someone out, if someone thinks that we should be accepting it as, as B with a, then I think that saves us a lot of discussion on C, on whether or not it becomes C. And if no one makes that motion, then I'll put forward my motion. But I also, I don't want to miss the fact that I think some discussion of 1.2 is worthwhile, because according to our survey, there were at least 4 people who didn't think the evidence was reasonable, and we haven't gotten to that yet.
Does anybody want to have discussion on 1.2? Yes, you're correct, Jesse. It is in there that 3 said yes and 3 said no. And this would be the appropriate time to have a discussion on that. If we're not going to have a discussion on that, then it is kind of a moot point. What I'm seeing is that, let's see, 1.2, isn't that the one that we're waiting for the information from?
Well, there was also 1.2.1, which had 4 people who didn't think that the evidence supported it. So, yeah, so, okay.
Right, that cannot be determined when we've already agreed that the data that Mr. Carpenter described earlier that is available that we didn't know was there, that he's going to look at and get back to us within a 6-month time frame, I believe is what he said. So to me, that one is has been put to rest. But the other one that you brought up, do you want to have discussion on that? Then now would be the time. So go ahead, Jesse.
I guess at this point, I'm gonna just wait a few seconds for someone to propose B, but I'm not putting that motion out.
Okay. We're making this very challenging on ourselves. All right, so would someone like to make a motion as to how they would like, the level that they would like to accept this report on? We've heard a recommendation of B. And we've also heard that Jesse has some issues with others, but I'm willing to take whatever motion someone is willing to put out there. We need to move forward.
I would make a motion that we accept the report with policy. Yeah, I'm getting there. With policy, well, hold on just a second. I want to make sure I make this motion clear. Motion to accept the report with the ability to review if need be, areas of the ends policies that the board may feel is not in line with the current level of compliance.
And which policies are those? We need to be specific. We can't say the entire monitoring report.
That's not for the motion though either. We separate out the policy discussion from the approval. Those are two different things.
So we could do two.
So if I could. My suggestion is that I have a motion I'd like to put out, which I think gets to what you're talking about, where we can discuss, where we'll settle whether, like, how we are approving this policy. And then after we have that vote, we can have a discussion about whether and how to have the policy itself addressed. So if you're all right, I'd like to make a motion that we accept this as C, that we have assessed the monitoring report and find the following. For policies 111, 122, or actually, I've got it written out. Basically, that we are going to accept this as the CEO has proposed it, with the exception of 111, where we find the interpretation is not reasonable. I have written out which of the policies we are accepting as the CEO has proposed under 1 and 4. But if you're kind of willing to let me gloss over that, it's what the CEO says, except for 111, which we're saying is 2.
Does anybody want to
How's that for
second
a
what
motion?
Jesse just said?
I'll second that.
So my motion is that we accept all policies that the CEO has noted as in compliance with reasonable interpretation as such, and that we accept all policies for which the CEO has stated non-compliance and proposed dates for compliance as such, with the exception of 111, which we accept as the interpretation is not reasonable.
Second,
Did you want to speak, Monica? Okay.
no, I was just seconding his motion.
Kyra, was that helpful? All right. Does anybody want to second that motion? Oh, Monica did. Okay, so Monica has seconded that motion, and now we're going to open it up for a vote. Before we do, is there any further discussion on this motion? Mike. Mike, go ahead, hon. Sorry, that was unprofessional.
Looking at how the 6 people answered 111, they all said yes to the interpretation. So I'm puzzled at why the board would now change their mind. And I appreciate Jesse's points, but I mean, that was one of the few ones that was unanimous in terms of a yes. Is there something I'm missing here, Jesse?
I don't think so. What I see this as is that we had a conversation and maybe minds were changed.
Okay.
And I'm only basing that on the fact that no one has disagreed with me, or no one has taken any action to disagree with me. So if people are just trying to get the conversation over with quicker, that's on them.
Yeah. And again, looking at the board response to the questionnaire, 112 evidence, I don't have it in front of me right now, but I think I recall that 4 people said it was not adequate. And so to me, that would be the logical one to have the exception to. But that doesn't mean that we can't, through a discussion, have different ideas that people change their mind. But I don't think I've changed my mind.
The CEO himself has noted that the CEO himself noted that the evidence was not adequate. So we're accepting it as he proposed it. So that's why I didn't accept it from. Yeah.
Okay, let me go back and look at 1-1.
So
Oh,
Mike,
no,
you
I
make a
had-
very good point, and Jesse, you called me out. Policy 1.1.1, I do not have the same concerns that the board has at this
Yeah.
time. With regard, or that Jesse and Rich have raised with regards to 1.1.1, where it talks about people with economic challenges have affordable public transportation options. For me, because this is backward looking, the answer is acceptable to me. I think it's reasonable, the evidence that he's provided and the interpretation that he has provided. I think where we're getting hooked into is that we wanted to see more, or we're concerned that people are not getting maybe a ride, or we're concerned about how we monitor or how they figure out who is low income and those procedures. And to me, that's all operational. So for me personally, as a board member, when I read these, I see it more as B, that it is in compliance, except for items as noted by the CEO himself. And then the additional of number 1.2.1, that while there isn't, it can't be determined at this time, the CEO has stated that he has a way to get data that we did not know that was available, I believe, through SEMCOG, and that he would come back to us within 6 months with that data. So that would have been my motion to propose based on everything that's happened tonight. Yes, Rich.
Yeah, so one, Mike, I appreciate your question. I think we as a board, the reason why we do have these board meetings discussion is potentially to change minds. Because actually, as I think about this, I probably should have been more critical with my thinking and my approach, and actually said that I didn't think actually 1.1.1 was compliant. And this is actually based on a very, very small piece of data point, but it was pretty impactful for me. It was one of the very early board meetings I was at, like whatever, 2 years ago when I first joined the board. And we had the public comment section, and one of, I can't remember her name, but one of our constituents did come on and mention that the pricing for, I think she was using a ride or gold ride, one of them. I'm sorry, I get them confused. But the rate, I think, had gone up. And she did mention that it was very impactful on her budget to be able to pay the fee that we're charging for that. So that's the part where I go, like, she is economically challenged, but she's actually not part of the data or the interpretation of this particular policy. Because in reality, like, this is just focused on fixed route. And so, yeah, I mean, yeah, based on that interpretation, the evidence does meet it, but I actually don't think that we're meeting the what the actual policy covers beyond just fixed route riders. So yeah, I don't know the best way to move forward, frankly. Like, if this is we accept it as is and then move forward to say, like, the next time we want more data. But I think this is where we can say, like, hey, the interpretation actually does not fit what, sure, in the past maybe it has, but today it doesn't for me.
Yes, Mr. Carpenter or Matt.
There's a clarification from the motioner, the mover, I don't know, the shaker, the mover, I don't know. Jesse, is it your thinking, and I'm learning here too, the interpretation, it's we sometimes say any reasonable interpretation. Are you saying it's, again, it's not what a reasonable person would do, but does it meet the, is it any reasonable interpretation? And that it's phrased that way to give me a wide latitude in operational decisions, any reasonable interpretation. If you still don't like the outcome of any reasonable interpretation, we can say, yeah, that is a reasonable interpretation. It's the policy that we need to go further on. But I'm hearing you say the precise flaw in the interpretation is its limitation to fixed route users. So that to me is a possibly valid criticism of the interpretation itself, to say it does not meet any reasonable interpretation because it only applies to some of the folks in the community. And what we actually meant was that this policy applies to every service in effect. Is that kind of where you're headed?
Yeah, I mean, that one was more Rich's, and so I kind of leave it to you. And further, Rich had me convinced on that one. That wasn't one that I came up with myself. My issue was more aligned with what Monica was saying, in that I don't find any compelling evidence that Medicaid eligibility it actually covers our low income population. You provided no evidence of that, which I personally think is a reasonable way to interpret it. However, that's not part of my motion because because they're two separate things. I can't say that number two, the interpretation is not I can't say that the interpretation is not reasonable and the evidence does not demonstrate compliance. So I was just gonna kind of skip over that and just go with two, because that is also true.
Okay, so your concern was with the evidence that Medicaid eligibility as a proxy for low income wasn't compelling.
I saw no evidence that the two were correlated.
For me, where I come into the conundrum there is that we do have specific policies about how we keep data on our riders. And it's been explained in the past when we've come up against this in ENDS reports before, where Medicaid is through a third-party agency, and that we do not have to hold data within our own agency, confidential, very personal data about people's income or lack of income and that sort of thing. And so to me, for last year, not moving forward, to me, it is appropriate to say Medicaid, because we don't have a system in place to look at it any other way, a safe way for people to share their income. What would that look like? How do other agencies handle this position? Does the CEO need to consider having a new position and having a social worker doing stuff like this? I mean, it really gets into a whole conundrum of other additional things, which are all operational in matter. And right now, there isn't another way besides Medicaid. So that is why, for me, it is a reasonable interpretation, because there isn't another way to do it. And if we want the CEO to consider other ways, then we either need to, I don't know, look at policy or have more discussion. But again, to me, we're looking at the last year, not what we want going forward. Does that make sense? Yes, Monica.
That's fair if we're talking about looking at the last year, because obviously we're looking at information in the past in comparison to information going forward, right?
Mhm.
And I'm assuming this data is for information in the past.
Correct.
Okay. So I know we're not having a discussion about policy necessarily going forward, but I did want to bring some of those things into the discussion. I also think that Rich's point about the paratransit, I believe, and Go Transit riders is also something that, thought wise going forward, that's what, we can look to bring into discussion to improve maybe the ends report when it comes from report 2020. I'm assuming at that point 4. I'm assuming this comes up every year, right? So yeah, and I do appreciate your point, Chair Kathleen. I appreciate the point, and it helps clarify.
Go ahead, Jesse.
I mean, so I have made this argument the past 4 years that this policy has come before me. So like, I'm hoping that maybe I finally convince some other people to come along with me on it. So in that, it is forward thinking, because I think this is how we tell the CEO whether or not we think that his chosen method over the past year did achieve our end. And I just personally don't, or the argument I'm making is that I don't think that he has achieved the end that we are seeking to achieve by making, I think by limiting the Fair Deal program just to Medicaid, unless he can provide evidence that that is serving, I have absolutely no idea what proportion of I know how many people, according to the report, are low income in our county. And I know how many people apply for the Fair Deal program, and it's a very small percentage, but that's kind of, that information is completely out of context. It might help me if I knew how many people, how much of the low income population were covered by Medicaid. If there was a sizable proportion of the low income population covered by Medicaid, then I could say, oh yeah, that's fair. But I see no evidence that says Medicaid is synonymous with low income in our community. There's a lot that goes into applying for Medicaid. There's a lot of other factors. And there are a lot of other agencies in our area that also have their own ways of deciding whether or not people of low income qualify for their services. And I think there are a number of ways that the CEO could choose to verify that they are, of an appropriate low income standard without collecting information. We could, I'm not telling him how to do his job. What I am saying is that what he's doing right now doesn't meet my standard, and I don't think it meets the standard of this organization. If he was looking to me for recommendations, I might say, let's find some partner agencies and organizations that are doing this kind of work and saying, hey, if you qualify for low income housing, then you also qualify for Fair Deal. If you qualify for, a food pantry or something, then you qualify for Fair Deal. There are a number of ways that we could do it. I have seen nothing that says Medicaid compliance on its own, which is the only qualification for the Fair Deal program, is adequate to reaching the low income population of our area.
I understand completely what you're saying. However, what I feel is that if we felt that way, this should have been addressed last year. That we're looking at a whole years of data, and we're placing our wants and our needs that are, Jesse, I'm not disagreeing with you. I think your points are extremely valid, but I also think that we need to give the CEO an opportunity to maybe talk with the people who give out the Fair Deal card to see if there are other ways that they are utilizing besides Medicaid to get people the Fair Deal card. I want to give him an opportunity to do that, to be successful over the next year. But my point is that we did not demand this before today, before us getting this report as a full board. You said you've raised the concern yourself, but we speak with one voice, and the full board has not given that direction to the CEO. So in effect, I think what we need to do is judge this report based on what he was asked to do over the last year. And then given the concerns that are being raised and the questions and the way that you're framing everything, we can move forward over this next year and figure how to proceed from there. Yes, go ahead, Rich.
So yeah, this is where I probably didn't frame it very well. So my procedure question though is like, how do we trigger that? Because if we leave this as compliance, like, I don't know who's going to track it. It's just going to be like, oh, it's compliant. Then we're going to go another year without something like a change, right? Because I think that's why it keeps repeating itself.
We're having two discussions. The first discussion is the monitoring report. Do we accept the monitoring report, and at what level do we accept the monitoring report? The second discussion is then, does the board see a need to look at these policies? And then if we decide that, because obviously we're hearing that we are not happy with how we've written these policies, we want to give the CEO, we don't want it to just be fixed route. We want it to be a little bit more encompassing. I don't know. And so then that becomes a policy discussion and then should go to committee, either service or I'm thinking governance committee, to then talk about the very things that have been brought up this evening, that we will track that's something that Jesse, as the secretary, has said that he would do, is track what policy discussions we need to have. But they're two separate things. So the first thing is we need to put the monitoring report to bed and figure out how the board wants to speak with one voice on what the CEO has presented here tonight for last year's data. And then have a separate discussion on how are we going to move forward with this policy, given the incredible amount of feedback that's been given, it is in a policy thing and it needs to go to the board for discussion on that. So they're two different things. So what I'd like to do is for us to keep them separate for now and really just focus in on what this monitoring report and at what level do we want to accept it. Once we put that to bed, then go on to the policy discussion and how we're going to move forward with that. And I'm sort of going to look to Matt not because you're on the board, but because part of your job as CEO is to support the board in policy governance. And I am new to the chair position. I just want to make sure that I've looked at all the things that I've learned about policy governance and the CGO responsibility, and am I hitting the mark by separating it and by having this?
I do think there are two separate conversations about the monitoring report versus in policy. If you accepted the monitoring report as compliant or a B, you could still have a conversation about setting additional policies. Like there's nothing to preclude that. I see Jesse's point about, or no, excuse me, Rich's point that fixed route, if it's limited to fixed route, the interpretation could be considered not meeting any reasonable interpretation. It's specific. You know, it's objective. You're not kind of wishy-washy about it. You're missing something. So that makes sense. I'm getting a little turned around with Jesse's thing, but I think I'm following him on the evidence is not compelling. I wonder if I could provide better numbers in this table. I think you even said it. Maybe I could demonstrate that, they are, getting to the close thing. What I mentioned, I walked back and talked to Rosa, because the low income population in this table is set to the same poverty threshold as Medicaid eligibility. That 48,962 low, that is still the definition of people who are Medicaid eligible. I'm not sure that's quite what you're getting at. But another option, and I don't know if you'll like this, Madam Chair, you have a motion on the table. I think that needs to be voted on. Depending on how that goes, and frankly, whether you get clarity on this decision or not tonight, you may want to ask Rose Mercier to watch the video and come back to us later and be like, okay, yeah, here's where you went off the rails. But this is, Jesse and Rich raised, I think, excellent questions, and I don't have a better answer for you other than, the policy changes should be future oriented. That's a separate thing than the motion to accept the monitoring report, and are at what stage.
So as Mr. Carpenter said, there is a motion on the floor and it has not been seconded. It has. Oh, right, by Monica. I apologize. There has been a lot of discussion tonight. So please bear with me. Thank you so much. It has been seconded by Monica. So now we're at could you please rephrase it again real quick, Jesse, for all of us who may have lost that train
Sure.
while we've been having this discussion?
So the motion on the floor or on the table is to accept the report as C, where, and again, I'm bridging here. And then my computer, that we agree that there is evidence of compliance with a reasonable interpretation as noted by the CEO on those policies, and on the policy, we also accept the policies where the CEO has stated non-compliance and proposed dates for compliance, with the exception of 111, which we are saying the interpretation is not reasonable.
And 111 would be what? 1, 2, 3, or 4?
That would be 2.
2.
So if here what I have, I did write it all out, all of the policies that the CEO that would fall under classification 1, all of them that would fall under 4, the 1 that falls under 2, and I'm not identified any as being under 3.
All right, so to rephrase, then you're asking for you put a motion on the table saying that C, the board has assessed the monitoring report for policy 1.0 and all of its sub policies, and that we're accepting, the only thing that we're not agreeing with is policy item 111, that we agree that the interpretation is not reasonable. Everything else that the CEO has said in here where he said is compliant, we're accepting. Everything where he said he's non-compliant, we're accepting everything there. So it's just 111. All right. And Monica, you seconded that? All right, board, all in favor of accepting the monitoring report as C, except for 111, the interpretation not being reasonable. Please raise your hands and say aye, and then give me a minute to look at everybody. 2, 3. Okay, I only have 3 votes on the floor. That did not pass.
You still have to do opposed and abstain.
I'm sorry, how many are opposed? And how many are abstained? How many were opposed? There were 4 of us. Okay, so that motion did not pass. So now we're back to the drawing board. Would someone like to make a counter proposal on how they would like to accept this monitoring report? Preferably someone who abstained or who, sorry. Yes, Chris, it has to come to you. No, preferably someone who did not accept the motion as presented. Yes, Simi?
I move that the board accept the monitoring report as reasonable, except for the CEO's stated non-compliance items.
So level B.
Yes.
Okay. Do I have a second on that? Seconded by Kyra. All right. All in favor, please raise your hands and say aye and give me a minute to count. 1, 2, 3, 4. I have 5 and that is a quorum. So that motion passed.
You still have to say who's opposed.
Oh, yes, I'm apologize. You know, is today Monday the 13th? Okay. Yes, I demand that my objections. So all objections, please raise your hands. So we have 2 and we have 3 objections. Thank you so much for helping me out there, Jesse. All right, that was a lot of work. So now we get to move on to the fun part, which there was a lot of hearty discussion. Oh, yes, Mike, go ahead.
Yes, I'm sorry. I just wanted to take a moment just to say, from my perspective as head of the monitoring task force, first of all, the ends policy is the most important policy that we have. And secondly, it's the most difficult one to address, both from the staff point and from the board point. And I think we did a good job. I had a lot of concern that our new format for the for judging and filling out and the policy monitoring, the new form would die or succeed based on this particular monitoring report, because it is the most important. It's also the most difficult. And I personally, it did better than I thought it would. And I think also I should mention, this is one of the few monitoring reports that doesn't go to a committee first. And I think rightfully so, because it really affects everybody and everything. So it makes it more difficult to discuss today. It was not without some interesting discussions, which I think were valuable. And I'm very pleased with how things turned out. And anybody, I just also like to solicit anybody who would like to give me comments, maybe through email or call me or something, on how you think this went, because it is the most difficult one to do. The task force would certainly like to learn from everybody's experience. Thank you.
Most definitely. Those were some very valuable comments that you provided there, Mike. Knowing, it's funny, when I first came on the board in 2018, and Jesse, we came on at the same time, I believe that winter, we had a full board retreat where we redesigned the ends. We spent the whole day working on the ends, and we really have not looked at this policy extensively. I think if I remember on our plan of work, we did talk about in our annual plan of work, and I'm wondering if rather than have this go to committee, that we were going to look at having Rose Mercier come and talk to us about policy during a board retreat, that I would like to suggest that we bring the ends with us so that we can address the very valuable concerns that were raised here this evening, so that the whole board would get a chance to participate in it. I know that is sort of a little bit of a fishtail turn because we had already set our plan of work, and I don't have it in front of me, but am I remembering correctly, Matt, that ends was ongoing, wasn't it, on our annual plan of work?
Yeah, the general sentiment is that ends is sort of built in every year after this monitoring report, prompted by the discussion of this monitoring report. You are supposed to at least have a cursory review of your ends. Your memory is good. You did have a big discussion several years ago about it. Then the board kind of took it on hiatus over the pandemic, didn't really revisit the ends for several years. Whether it results in ends or as I sort of wondered earlier out loud, maybe that's an executive limitation. I'm not sure. Either way, you're writing policy. Either way, you're scoping the future of the organization. I'll leave it to the board to decide, but yes, what Rosa and I had been talking based on your work plan, that Rose Mercier will come and the retreat will be about writing policy as something you guys said you wanted to do. Certainly this conversation could be something she uses as fodder for populating that conversation or inspiring that conversation, I should say.
Would the board be amenable to that? Jesse, would that help go along with allaying your fears and your concerns about this policy, so that the whole board could take part in the conversation, have Rose there to direct us and really get into a meaty discussion rather than take it to committee?
I would kind of defer. I say again what I said before. I personally don't think the problem is with the policy. I do think the issue, my issues were very specifically with the CEO's interpretation. It was just that the board didn't agree with me. So I'm maybe not the right person to ask about that.
I know that, Rich, you raised the question and the concern that you felt that the policy seemed to be interpreted as only being fixed route, whereas the board's intent when we wrote the ends was to be about all the services that it provided. It may be that we need to take a look at having that actually in the ends policy. Does that need to be in the ends policy, that we're not just talking about fixed route, but that we're talking about all services? And that may be a very good discussion to have with Rose Mercier.
Yeah, I really like Matt's suggestion of having Rose take a look at the video and then maybe what her recommendation is, we go off of that.
Okay. So then we're going to table this for tonight, but we are coming back to it. We're not going to forget it. We're going to ask Rose Mercier, our governance coach, to have a look at our very, it can be looked at as being messy, but I look at it as it's a learning opportunity for all of us. There are so many board members who were here when policy governance was first put into play. I believe there are only two of you left, Kyra and Mike. And so we're sort of, we're on a really high learning curve. We're relooking at our policies. So I think that what happened here tonight, I find it very hopeful and heartful that everyone is really, embracing policy governance. And while it can be messy and maybe some people might think that it may be a waste of time, I found it very engaging and I learned so much this evening. So I want to thank everyone. So we're going to have Rose take a look at our tape, and then how do we want her feedback? Do we want her feedback at committee level, or would we like her to present at the next board meeting and have a discussion at that point? I'm open to either. Whatever you think is going to be the best for us in our learning process. Yes, Monica.
I mean, I'm open to board level, because I think it's really important if we see, like, that was something that just came right out to me in the report, the ends report, and this is the first time I've ever seen it. So if we see things of that nature, what is the proper protocol for discussion at the board level? I mean, I believe you should discuss it if you see it, because that's what the public meeting is about. Even if you're not making the policy, even if you're not, if it's front end or back end, look like this is more back end, but in the same aspect, looking for the future. If you don't discuss it, you haven't said anything. So you just voted it in and you didn't raise any reservations. So I hope it would be discussed at the board level, whatever, I guess you could say qualifications. Maybe that's not the right word. More like evaluations that she saw about the discussion.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Rich.
Yeah, so I understand where Monica's coming from. I think it's just more of like a timing thing, because in the end, like all the board members are on, I think it's either services or finance committee. And so it's more just like, do we want to have her talk? She would probably, my guess, she would bring it up with both committees. And then we had discussions, and then at the board meeting, of course, it would come up because we'd have to make a decision about that. But it's just more of like a timing of like earlier or sooner than later.
Yeah. Matt, I think you might have some suggestions. You've seen this before.
Oh, no, I'm good. No, this, yes. Just thinking about your question. Typically what Rose does is provides a coaching report in writing. She'll look at a video and sort of go through it and be, okay, here's what I saw. Here's what you did well. Here are some things where maybe you went off the map a little bit. That thing in writing can be circulated to all of you. This was a really good discussion. It was a really good learning point. I picked up memory things too. I would encourage you to continue that learning as a group, as opposed to, you could do it in separate committees, but she would give you the exact same thing. The difference would be you're not all together. And I think there's value in you being all together when you have that conversation and hear from her. So the report can be circulated as soon as it's ready. But if you want to come back and look at this and where do you go from here with some of the things that were discussed, I would encourage you to do that as a group.
Yes, Justin.
I like that idea. I think it fits really well under our new board education section in our new. So I don't know how long Rose would need to generate this document. Like if 1 month is enough, then I might ask that we have it on our agenda for next month. Pending her agreement to that timeline.
We could do that, or originally we were going to do DEI in March, but we have put that back. And we actually discussed using March as a time to meet with Rose. Perhaps that is the way that we could do that, rather than have it on the next board agenda, actually have it as part of a board retreat. Or were we looking at taking the retreat out altogether, and you would prefer to take time at the next board meeting to have Rose speak with us and look at this?
My understanding of your work plan that you approved the other month was that one of the things you wanted to do was focus on learning how to write policy.
Mm-hmm.
That was very specifically, I think it was something Rich brought up. We haven't really been trained to do that, and it's true. Subsequently, I asked for governance committee for more time on the equity retreat. They agreed, and I appreciate that. That does give us the possibility of bringing forward something else from the work plan into March. Unfortunately, a date hasn't been set for that, so I'd need Deb to speak with you all and make sure we find a good time. And what the governance committee had discussed was maybe it's the planning thing that comes forward, because that's how the board sets the future. It's a fundamental thing. This, to me, there are elements of the discussion today that, yes, could become policy, maybe executive limitations, maybe refinements of the ends, and therefore that would be useful with Rose, but there was also a lot of, it's wrapped up in the monitoring. Jesse and Rich raised, I think, valid points about, is the interpretation reasonable? Is the evidence compelling? I've got to go back and talk with Rosa about, how do we feel about that conversation? That muddies the water a little bit from the strict thing that you put in your work plan. So what I might suggest for your consideration tonight is just, let's ask Rose if she can give you a coaching report. Watch the video. What did you see? And oh, by the way, can you conduct a retreat on writing policy? And let's have another conversation with her at the next board meeting and see how it shakes out. I would guess that we might be able to figure out, okay, which one of this was, how much of this was a monitoring question, how much of this was a policy question, and then go forward into the retreat, but keep that focused on policy writing. Maybe the ends are useful there, but maybe something inspired by tonight's conversation will help give that some more tangible grit.
At the end of this meeting, when we talk about topics for next meeting, I will make sure to include Ends follow up with Rose Mercier, and hopefully she will be able to have that ready for us. It will also determine on her bandwidth. She may not be able to watch and have a report ready for us within 1 month, depending on her other issues. So we'll put it on there tentatively, but we are not going to lose traction on this. And I just want to say thank you to Rich and to Jesse for bringing the concerns that they brought forward. We had some really good, healthy dialogue tonight, and it was just a really good learning experience and a growth experience for us. So thank you. All right. I think we have now wrapped up everything on the ends monitoring report and how we're going to follow up on policy. So we're now going to move on to strategy and operational updates and the quarterly one financial report by Ms. Dina Reed. Thank you, Dina.
Thank you. On page 61 of your packet, you have the fiscal year 2023 Q1 financial statement. This, as noted in the issue brief, this was presented to the Finance Committee and discussed in detail on February 7th. This evening, I'm just going to highlight some of the key factors that I think are important in terms of monitoring financials. We did operate within budget within the first quarter of the fiscal year. In fact, we did generate a surplus of 3.9 million for the quarter, which meets or beats expectations by about $1 million. That was primarily a result of a reduction in expenses for the quarter. And there was an unfavorable performance related to revenue, and that's mostly related to some of those revenues are a function of the expenses. So if we come in below on expenses, some of the revenues will also come in lower because we get a percentage of state operating assistance, and that's reliant on that. So that's the biggest unfavorable number in the revenue area. Going through the rest of the report at a high level, we note the use of federal pandemic relief funds, which we are continuing to use to the extent that we have eligible expenses throughout this fiscal year. We do expect to have enough federal pandemic relief funds to continue that practice through the rest of the year, and we'll keep you informed how that goes. And you can see we used $4 million in the first quarter. On the next page, in the assets and reserves, you can see that we are meeting our operating reserve balance in months and dollars. We are exceeding our target, our reserve target. So we're on point in terms of the direction that we have enough in reserve to maintain a cash flow for operations. And additionally, our assets are still stable. Our investments are at 19.3 million. We ended the quarter with 34.1 million in cash and have met all of the requirements and reserve requirements for the quarter. I will also like to note on the report that the quarter is not fully closed. Generally at this time, we would have closed the first quarter, but due to unexpected issues with staffing and finance, we are working through some things. So in Q2, there could be some minor adjustments to Q1, as we finish closing out the quarter, but are confident that a majority of the revenues and expenses are accurate and complete in the report.
Well, and to be fair, you're also in the middle of an audit, so we do understand, I do understand completely. I'm wondering, are we on target then with our the monies that we're setting aside so that we're building up our capital funds and things like that? We are still on target with all of that?
We are on target and we'll have the final numbers for last fiscal year will be finalized soon through the audit process. But you will notice that under the reserves, the capital reserves increased at the end of Q4 2022 to 23.3 million. That's the current estimate based on the close for fiscal year 22. And if we were to place the 3.9 million of surplus in reserve, which we don't do it on a quarterly basis, we do it at the end of the year, once we know what all the revenues and expenses are for the year. But if we did, that balance would be somewhere around 27 million. And so we do expect by the end of the year, this year, to be in excess of 30 million if everything holds and we stay on budget, as I've reported that Q1 was.
Excellent. Does anybody have any questions for Dina? Thank you, Dina.
You're welcome.
And to your staff as well. We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Next on our agenda is the quarterly one service report, and that'll be Mr. Troy Lundquist. Welcome.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, Madam Chair, esteemed board members. Monica and Chris, I don't think we've met yet. So my name is Troy Lundquist. I'm the manager of Fleet Services. And I have the esteemed honor of presenting the quarterly 2023 quarter one service report. Before I begin, I just want to make a couple notes. We're looking at the report is that our measuring sticks on this. We have a couple more than would in past. So to make an accurate representation of pre-pandemic quarterly service, we measure from current quarter to quarter one of 2019, and then additionally to show through the pandemic recovery process, quarter one of 2022 to 2023 as we move through here. So starting on page 65 of your packet, the service committee meeting was conducted on January 31st and was presented in detail, and move forward with that. So moving on to page 66, fixed route ridership and cost. If you look at the two charts, both the quarterly comparison and the route ridership comparison, you're basically seeing a picture of continued sustained returned ridership from pre-pandemic conditions up until now, or from the pandemic conditions up until now. With that, with the increase in ridership, you see a decrease in the cost of per passenger per boarding. And as our ridership goes up, our cost per boarding will go down. So one quick highlight, and was noted in one of our other in the service meeting, was that our ridership is now just over 1.1 million riders for the quarter one of 2023, which is an outstanding recovery. Moving forward, cost per boarding, again, we were operating from pre-pandemic conditions in 2019 with about 114% cost per boarding to what we were today to what we were in 2019. However, if we look in 2022 to 2023, we see a 30% increase, 39% increase in ridership, which also led to a 12% decrease in overall cost. Moving on to page 68, fixed route satisfaction, reliability, and safety. The satisfaction report shows a decrease in overall complaints. Complaints are calculated by 100,000 boardings. And just we could go and take a look at this and the reasons why and the interpretations of why we are seeing less complaints. So it could be that we don't have the 1.6 million riders that we did have. However, with the recovery in process, we've instituted a couple new internal SOPs in dealing with customer service. We've instituted de-escalation training upon hire, and we've also instituted a new customer service training platform for all of our call takers and customer service representatives. So we think with those three pieces, coupled with video verification of any complaint, we've seen a good reduction in any type of complaints. Reliability of on-time performance still is unavailable at this time. The IT team is working with CleverCAD, and we are working through that process now. I'm sorry, Matt, did you raise your hand? I apologize. Okay. Fixed route road calls and measure of reliability. This metric, I'm very proud to say, has not been available for almost the last year. We now have it. So I just want to give a quick shout out to the IT team and to our fleet services team. It was about a 9-month process to go back, upload, re-verify all of the data in there. It was a monumental lift, and we were able to get this done. The very long short of this is that in comparison, we've seen a 45% reduction between 2019 and 2023, and that reduction is actually a decrease in roadside incidents or mechanical incidents. And then from 2022, we have a very exciting number of 150%. However, that is not a very realistic comparison, because 2022 had a number of weather incidents. So to create a better calculation that is a little bit more realistic to overall performance, we averaged 2022 to 2023 and came up with approximately 14%. A-Ride and paratransit costs on page 69 of your packet shows, again, just another continual incremental increase in ridership. But I would like to note Gold Ride members shows the largest increase since pre-pandemic ridership. So just wanted to give a quick shout out to our mobility team. They've made great efforts in continual outreach and advocacy programs across all the communities. And we think that this is having a minor impact on it. On page 70, ridership and cost over time with A-Ride is continually, as ridership increases, we're seeing a decrease in the cost per rider. Generally speaking, there's not been any great waiver or sign in this. So as ridership increases, costs will decrease. Van ride data remains limited at this time. So we have increased our van pool to 100, which is within 15% of the last, within pre-pandemic ridership for van pool. And finally, flex ride ridership has shown a continual decrease over the last couple of quarters. As indicated in your packet, we had a reduction of overall service area. And then with the return to campus, our mobility team has identified a couple an increase in shared rides into our service pattern for our fixed routes. So we're seeing a minor correlation there. More study needs to be taken in the future with that. On page 72 is an itemized list of metrics of how we came up with this data. And on page 73 is just a glossary of terms for the report. Pending any questions, I'm going to let you get on to the most exciting portion of this, the zero emission bus. By Matt.
Thank you, Troy, so much. I actually have a question, but I'll open it up to the board first. Does anyone have any questions for Troy? No, okay. So my question is, I'm seeing the ridership complaints for fixed route. I'm not seeing a graph for paratransit. I do see that it is here under the service report, but my old eyes are having a really hard time reading the numbers. And I'm wondering if you can tell me how we're doing as compared to the comparison that you're making for other quarters with regards to complaints, compliments, and have there been any valid ADA complaints that we've had to deal with?
So as of now, there are no valid ADA complaints that we've received for quarter one. Okay. Additionally, to ask your second part of your question, in terms of graphing and just displaying an image, that overall graph does include the paratransit services as well. So I just wanted to make sure that if we can look at this in the future as a possible separate graph and something we can identify working with George moving forward. Does that
Thank you.
suffice, Kathleen? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, it did, because when I read it, it says ridership for, and complaints for fixed route. It doesn't say paratransit next
My
to it. So
apologies.
that's why I didn't understand. So my apologies for not seeing that. And I just wanted to give our newer board members a little bit of context when Troy talks about data and having to mine data in the past. You may not be aware that we had a cyber attack over a year ago, and not last October, but the October before that. And so that really put a monkey wrench into a lot of being able to get data and things like that. So we're very excited that you have moved along as far as you had. And thank you so much, Troy, for giving us this information.
Thank you, Kathleen. Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, our big, yes, ZEB propulsion recommendations, Mr. Carpenter. Do we need a bio break? If we can, if we need to. Shall we take a 5-minute break? Is 5 minutes enough? All right, let's, it's 9 PM. We'll come back at 9:05 for the public. We'll be right back. Thank you, everyone. It's now 9:07 PM and we're getting ready to start back up again. Thank you for your patience. Mr. Carpenter, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Over the next 2 hours, no, I'm kidding. Sorry. That shouldn't have been as funny to me as it was. It was your reactions, actually. Okay, sorry. I'm happy to present you some preliminary CEO recommendations on the alternative propulsion, zero emissions propulsions work. A couple of things off the top. First of all, there are no decisions tonight. I'm not asking you for decisions. We have plenty of time to continue to discuss this. Also, there's a lot of details I look forward to bringing you over the coming months. I do not have this recommendation isn't as far advanced, particularly on the financial side, as I wanted it to be. But with the bandwidth of staff and shortages in certain areas, I've brought it as far forward as I can. There's still some work to do in that area, but that actually gives us an opportunity not to dwell on spreadsheets and detailed numbers, but to talk about sort of the conceptual issues that are involved here. So agenda, and I'm going to go through my slides as quick as I can, and then we're going to open it up for discussion. Going to start with just overview of the process, because we've got some new people with us. Go through my recommendation, the rationale. Again, it's a preliminary one. It is a general one. I don't have the specifics, so there's yet to come. I'll talk about the next steps and exactly where we will go next. And then it's sort of your discussion and your question. I have a couple of what I think are the key issues that you may want to think about grappling with as part of this discussion. Quick process update. In policy governance, you know, the means are delegated to the CEO. So I'm going to make a recommendation to you about this very technical subject, but you ultimately make the decision. There are budget decisions here. There are grant authorization decisions here. There's paperwork only you can approve for the federal government. So you are very much in the driver's seat, but staff have an important role here in giving you their best professional judgment. The key issues, if I were to guess, where your decisions are going to pivot on are going to be questions of priorities and risk tolerance. And I will come back to those themes throughout this presentation. There is a grant application deadline in the spring of 2024 that we're shooting for. That's, you'll see in my timeline later, that I'm working backwards from that to give us time to sort these things out, have the discussions with you, get to a prompt decision, and then move forward. So this is an action-oriented sort of discussion. Okay, real quick recap. You do have a goal. You have an ends policy, which are your strategic outcome goals that you set for me about reducing pollution. It's policy 122. It's not the only one. You have several ends, as we started discussing this evening. And the job is, part of my job is to move all the balls down the field, not just one. We're not working in a vacuum here. But with reducing pollution and ultimately eliminating pollution, I believe is the ultimate goal here. There's two ways to do that. One is increasing ridership. All the people we can get out of cars and onto buses is generally better at an aggregate level, but then also reducing our own footprint. One of the things we saw in the monitoring report concept was the idea of going from transit options to transit operations in terms of environmental footprint in this policy. This is very much in tune with the reducing the footprint of our operations, not just the services that we provide. So we began this process last year. We conducted desk research. We hired a consultant to bring us sort of the state of the practice and develop a report. All of you should have that report at your tables. Thank you for your patience. That is the final version of it. You saw a draft earlier last year. There was public engagement as part of that report. There was staff engagement, and you had a retreat in October. All that was to give us the facts. That report does not make a recommendation. It does not reach a conclusion. It's really just intended to bring us up to sort of the state of the practice. But it did identify really two main technologies if we want to eliminate tailpipe emissions to look at: battery electric buses and fuel cell electric buses, which are hydrogen powered buses. But there are pros and cons to both, and they will be part of my discussion this evening. Now, a couple of key observations. We're moving from the report into your CEO's observations here. The technology really isn't ready. The buses will roll, yes, but as we'll discuss going through here, will it work at scale, in a large scale application? Will it work for an entire fleet? These are open questions. From what I have seen, the technology is making steady progress, but it's not perfect yet. We're probably on the cutting edge of being able to do it very consistently, but we're not quite there yet. Part of what we're seeing is a lot of assumptions as opposed to facts. The way I explain this to the staff is there are data we need. How will the batteries' energy capacity improve over the next 5 years? How much better are these batteries going to be? I don't know. Ask me in 5 years. How much cheaper is hydrogen going to get when the supply lines get better and the new regional hubs come online that the federal government's trying to produce? I don't know. Ask me in 5 years. The data exists in the future. That's the stuff we need to make a fully insightful decision. We just don't have it yet. That's sort of the bleeding edge where it is. So that's what I mean by assumptions. And we start to get into a situation with some of the modeling in here where we're stacking assumptions on top of best guesses. One of my heroes is General Colin Powell, and he had some good comments that resonated with me about, in leadership, sometimes you need to make decisions without perfect information, without 100% information. He's thinking military, right? You got to be willing and able to make decisions with only 70% of the information you need. Because if you try to wait for 100%, you're never going to get there. And you're going to be waiting so long that the moment has passed. 70% I can deal with. Generally, I would not bring you a recommendation without even higher percentage of confidence that I was giving you good advice. Where we are right now in this whole thing, 40 to 50% information. That's kind of where we are. So there's things we can see clearly, and there's things that are still moving forward. Risks and trade-offs are going to be required. There's no such thing as a free lunch here, but this is okay. But we just need to consciously understand we are getting into something that's a bit more speculative, a bit more risky than we normally do. It's not to say we can't do it. I actually believe there is a path forward, and I'm going to walk you through my recommendation because it is that path. But we also know there's a lot of political and public expectations for more immediate action. So we kind of got a rock and a hard place moment for ourselves here that some of us may want to go slower, some of us may want to go faster, and we may be kind of in the middle. That's okay. That's not a bad thing, but it is something we have to acknowledge and reconcile. Now, you've seen this chart before. It's a standard risk matrix. I would say right now we're in the low risk, low reward category, the green space. We're comfortable, we're safe. Where we're trying to go here is into the beige area, higher risk, higher reward. There is no way to get the pollution reductions without some degree of risk. We have to accept that. We are moving to the right side of this table. What we want to avoid is the red square. The red square looks like some sort of failed deployment, a lot of money sunk into something that doesn't work. Whoops, we picked the wrong one, back up, throw it in the trash, start over. or frankly, we didn't reduce any emissions. That's what the red square looks like. That's what we're trying to avoid. Little bit of context recap here. There are a lot of benefits, I think here that we need to put in context. Carbon reduction and pollution reduction are important. It's not a lot in the grand scheme. If you remember in the report, it's less than 0.5% of all the carbon emissions in the area, but everybody's going to have to do their part if we're going to stop climate change. Everyone's got to do a little bit better every day if we're going to get up this hill. So even though it may not be a huge lift, I think there is a lot of value. The symbolism is, I think, as important, if not more important. This kind of gets into the intangibles. You have an ends policy we just discussed. The last one is about public support for public transit, even among people who don't ride. I think this is an important one. I think there's also values in the symbolism of an agency like us stepping into this space, giving people the permission to do it themselves, or the greater confidence in doing it. There are risks. The risks are primarily on the financial side. They come down to basically overextending ourselves, overextending our money, overextending our staff capacity. But there's also a risk of inaction, right? What if we didn't do anything? What if we waited too long and Colin Powell's moment passed? That's a risk we don't want to lose track of either. Why take the risk at all? Well, you gave me a goal. You've given me a task. I can't ignore that. I need to move that ball down the field. Climate change is a real thing. We need to do our part. Point 3 is important. I need to reiterate this. I think we're probably going to be compelled to do this at some point. California has a mandate. All transit agencies must be zero emission by 2035. I don't know how they're going to do that, but that's what the state legislature has dictated. We don't have a mandate in Michigan yet, but we are seeing the federal government attach or tie bar important grants to progress here. To execute our long-range plan, we're going to need a new bus garage. The grant program for the bus garage is now contingent on you guys promising to move forward in this space. So we can't really move the long-range plan forward until we start to make some progress here. So that's important to understand. Political pressure, which is kind of the same as what I was just talking about, but we also need to remember at the local level, there's a lot of expectations in various communities. It's not the same across every community, stronger in some places, but it's there. And I believe the technology is just becoming viable. Again, I think there is a path from the green to the beige that avoids the red. Okay, ready? Here comes the preliminary recommendation. All right. So first is on the timing. Again, I'm gonna say, let's look to 2024. That gives us the time we need to have a fulsome discussion here. Buys time for a little more coordination, particularly with some local regulatory and safety agencies. A little more time for the technology to mature. I don't believe it's going to fundamentally change in 6 to 10 months, but some of the risks might narrow up. We certainly will be able to get more precise on the financials. I think that's going to be a big thing. And staff readiness. We're filling a lot of roles right now. Being able to get people in those places would make us all very happy. But then it also gives you opportunities to discuss this. We don't need to make a decision tonight. You have time. A couple of principles came up to me as I was going through this. There's a lot of stuff in your executive limitations that guide me in making this decision. I cannot risk financial jeopardy. I cannot go into debt. I cannot make obligations that we can't pay for. I can't ignore that we have multiple priorities. I can't just look at one ends policy and ignore all the rest. I can't ignore staff. I'm going to come back to that one. And overall, I can't be imprudent. And that's the global one. And that's going to come up quite a few times today. I have to move all the capital projects forward. All of your ends require some degree of capital investment. I can't put all the money in all the eggs in one basket. And the bullet point's important. For me, based on what I have seen, what I've heard, that the propulsion discussions are secondary to the infrastructure investments. Now, that is my prioritization. If you feel differently, I need to know that as soon as possible, because that will change the direction. I'm not saying that propulsion doesn't move forward. In fact, you're going to see I'm proposing to move it forward. But if I have to make a guess about how much money to put where, this is how I'm doing it. I just want to be explicit with you. Yes, it gets some money, but it doesn't get the most money. But that's because we got a lot of other things going on. Our local funds, you had some good questions about the capital reserve for Dina. That's the choke point, ladies and gentlemen. That's where the whole thing will run out of gas earliest, is going to be our local capital funds, because all the big projects require the big competitive grants from the Federal Transit Administration. We have to bring some local money to the table. Preliminary back of the napkin envelopes that we're going to run out. We're going to run out way before we're done. So we're going to have to get a lot of outside money and husband that local capital reserve very carefully. And then I got to advance your goals, but I can't get too far ahead of you. This is complicated stuff. I need to make sure you guys are with me as we go forward. There's a lot of technical stuff here. I know some of you have committed the report to memory. Some of you, it's still pretty dense stuff. So we have time. I want to make sure we're all moving forward together. Okay. First of all, we're talking tailpipe emissions here. Upstream production of energy is going to be carbon intensive for years, whether it's electrical from coal plants or gray hydrogen. It's there. We're going to work on tailpipe. Hopefully the production stuff will catch up. Second, fleet management for success. I've noticed when talking about this with people around town, they frequently go to what they know, which is, you know, my cousin's Tesla behaves ... I really need to push everyone. This is not a car. This is not a single vehicle. We're working with something at a much larger scale. We have 103 heavy duty buses. We manage the fleet, not individual vehicles. Each one is a heavy duty bus, can be in continuous operation for 16 hours straight in freezing cold weather. It's got to run a space heater to heat the passenger compartment. This is not what a Tesla does. There's 103 of them. They cycle through constantly. We worry about things like economies of scale, interoperability, standardization. Some people don't realize that we do not assign buses to routes or drivers. A driver shows up in the morning to drive Route 4 like he did yesterday. He just takes the first bus as it's in line. It's a different bus than he had yesterday. It's going to be a different bus than he has tomorrow. That's why they have to be interoperable, and they have to all be able to do the longest route in our system, because they might have to. The fuel tanks, the diesel tanks in the buses today can keep a bus going for about 2 days. We don't have to worry about refueling. So there's a lot of economies of scale and efficiency in our operations that come from that fleet management. Some of these propulsion issues challenge those things. That means higher operating costs. That threatens the operating budget. That impacts the tax base and how much money we can spend on services. So we have to be aware of the downstream implications. Okay, fun stuff. Technology. Yay, Rich is with me. He's like, yeah, technology. Okay, there are 3 broad directions we could go. Battery electric buses, hydrogen fuel cell buses, or stick with the diesel. That's kind of your baseline status quo. So let's talk about it. Battery electric buses. Here's a picture of a Swedish bus. The important thing I want you to notice here is the funny thing hanging down out of the top. That's the charging mechanism. It's an automatic charging thing that descends to touch the battery, load it up. It's called a pantograph. This is important. There's a lot to like about the battery electric buses. The incremental costs are cheaper. It's faster to do, lower risk to deploy at a small scale. You can buy a lot of these quickly, like if you're only buying a handful of them. That's why I think they're popular right now. These are very good for window dressing exercises, to be blunt about it. You don't have to make heavy investments. You just sort of buy a couple of chargers and there you go. One thing I really like about these things is they have the simplest mechanical systems. You open up the back, it's just a big battery and some wires connected to the electric motors. It's great from like a maintenance perspective. This is going to be cheap. Internal combustion engine with all its moving parts and belts and fans, like this is completely simplified. I love that part about it. And the battery technology is improving. It gets a little bit better every year, and it may, based on the consultant's report, actually have the lowest life cycle costs overall. Heaviest capital costs, but lowest operating costs. But there are some significant cons to the electric bus. The buses are more expensive. we just have to get used to that, guys. All of them are more expensive. So that's just what it costs to sit at the table. The chargers don't scale. This is important. Every one of those overhead things, every bus you got, you need to buy another one of those. Hook it to the roof of the barn. Build more of them on the street. It's a one-for-one relationship to the fleet size. So that means it doesn't become more cost effective as the fleet gets bigger. That's one of the reasons you see this graph here, which does come from the report. And what that graph basically shows is that with a small fleet of fuel cell buses, it's more effort and cost to do it, but it gets cheaper as the fleet gets bigger. The opposite holds for the battery buses. Part of the reason is the chargers. With fuel, hydrogen, you're going to see, I got a fuel pump, just like the diesel pump. There's only one. If the fleet's 100 buses, 200, 300 buses, just one pump. That's very efficient. More important than the chargers is the range anxiety. And again, this is not for an individual vehicle. This is for the big, we're cycling them through all the routes. The reality is the battery electric buses cannot run a full day without being recharged, especially in winter, especially when you got to run the heater. This is where the batteries have their biggest challenge. It has to do with the energy density of what a lithium ion battery is capable of. Like I say, it's getting better, but the technology right now is not there. It will take a lot of effort and incur a lot of risks to redesign our services to accommodate the propulsion system. The benefits are relatively modest, but the effort is considerable. This could cause loss of efficiency, loss of economies of scale, more higher operating costs. That trickles down into impacts to the budget and possibly to passengers. Fleet growth. Normally, when we replace a diesel bus, we replace it with one new diesel bus, 1-to-1. Electric buses, it's 1-to-2 and may still be 1-to-3 in some cases to equal the same amount of uptime. That is a problem for a couple of reasons. Most importantly, I'm expanding the fleet to provide the same amount of service that we were doing. There's no more additional uptime. There's no more passengers. There's no in-service time. There's just the utilization's dropped. We hit a wall pretty quickly in this strategy because our garage is full today. In year one, if we go in this direction, I can buy like 2-3 battery buses, which means 4 to 6 battery buses, and then we're done. And then I can't expand the battery bus fleet until I build you a new garage, which is like 10 years out. So this has like a self-defeating thing built into it, not prudent. Now there's a lot of hope for battery improvements, which could deal with the range anxiety. It won't fix the charger thing, but it'll fix the range anxiety. The issue around here, it's in the report, and I see it with all the people I talk to. There's a lot of hope for battery improvements, assumptions, but it's not here today. Will it be here tomorrow? Will it be here 5-10 years from now? I don't know. I can't promise you that it will, because it has to do with technological development that it's over my head. So if there's a breakthrough in batteries, this could be a very viable path forward. If the energy density can be increased, the weight to size ratio can be dealt with, this could work. But if it doesn't, between that and the chargers, this could become a technological dead end. It may only be get to a certain size and that's done. There are a couple other cons. It has the highest capital costs. It's not necessarily a deal killer. Mining and replacement of the batteries, lithium ion mines, not great, but you got to mine stuff to build everything. So, okay. Something that's more recently really been focused on my attention is the risk of a catastrophic garage fire cannot be completely ignored. It's one of these things that's a low probability, but an extremely high risk kind of thing. Lithium ion batteries burn. All buses can burn, anything can burn. And I have seen diesel buses burn. Generally, they burn when they've been moving and something wasn't lubricated and the friction set it off. Lithium ion batteries have sometimes just spontaneously ignited while they're being charged overnight in a garage when there's nobody there to watch it. We park our buses really, really close together. 8 rows across, 10 buses deep. It's like a big chessboard. If the one in the middle caught fire, it's hypothetically possible we could lose most of the fleet. The smoke damage would be remarkable. These things don't smolder. It's like a blowtorch coming out of the roof. The black smoke is intense. Even if the buses that didn't burn would be so smoke damaged, we couldn't put them into service. The whole building might be out of service for a long time. Again, low probability, but extremely high risk. And then just with batteries, it's more complex. You know, the onboard systems are simple, like I said, but everything else seems to be more complicated. You need more partners. You have to work with the utility. You got regulations that you need to do. Those overhead charging stations, we think we'd need at least, we'd need them in at least 3 different communities. So I'd have to work with 3 different municipalities to put a high voltage charging thing in their public right of way that they've never dealt with before. That's going to take time. It's going to introduce hurdles, any one of which could be a tripping hazard. So there's just a lot of hurdles for batteries that they'd have to overcome. It may happen, but it's just more complex. Hydrogen ain't perfect, but by comparison, there are some real benefits in our situation. Only got 1 fueling pump, and there's less range anxiety. So there's really no concern about fleet growth or having to do a different garage. We can probably do a 1-for-1 replacement. We could convert our whole fleet with the garage we have. So this is a real important thing because it means we can make a lot of progress until we can build another garage. It's less change for staff. You know, the bus pulls up tonight. They're pumping them full of diesel right now, I tell you. They can just do the same thing with a different pump. No, very little change for them. Fewer things to go wrong, fewer points of failure. Little financial risk to the services or passengers because of the 1-for-1 thing. It's lower cost than diesel, not as cheap on the operating as the batteries might be, but again, those are assumptions. And overall, fewer risk, less hope is involved. There's less magical thinking necessary for this to become completely viable. Smaller batteries, they still have batteries. We can't get away from that, but they're there. And we may be able to go green. You know, there's a difference between dirty hydrogen and clean hydrogen. One of our sister agencies down in Illinois has built an electrolysis station on their property. They can manufacture their own green hydrogen from solar power now. This technology exists today. And this is a big difference between batteries and the hydrogen. The hydrogen technology that exists today, we could do it. It's expensive, but we could do it. Battery technology, no, it wouldn't work. There are some cons to hydrogen. We need to be clear. It's really expensive on the front end. That big fueling station, that's got to be built before you can have any buses. So you got to front load that whole thing, as opposed to the individual chargers for the batteries, which are a lot cheaper. The buses are they are the most expensive. So they're 10% more than the 50% more expensive battery buses. The fuel supply lines and costs are uncertain. This is a big one. We're talking about the ecosystem out there to support these new technologies. If I want to buy a truckload of hydrogen today, it's coming from Sarnia, Ontario, or down by Chicago. That's not workable. It needs to be a lot closer. The feds are investing a lot in hydrogen hubs to try to get more green hydrogen production in more places around the country. So this should change and the costs should come down, but again, assumptions. The maintenance, it's less than the diesel, but more than the battery. So that's, you know, comparatively. And if the battery technology really improves, that could leave this as a dead end. But I think I may have glossed over on the battery side. Batteries could be a dead end too. So this leads us into what I call the VCR Betamax moment. Or if I'm not dating myself here, the MySpace friend Facebook thing. We have 2 technologies that are coming up. It's entirely possible one of them will be completely obsolete and forgotten on the dustbin of history within 10 years. I don't know which one it is. We got a 50-50 chance of picking it wrong or right. That's not great odds. We gotta do better than that. But this is a fundamental issue we can't get away from. A third option is to stay with diesel. Why would I even suggest that? It would basically be a bridging strategy. It's the technology we know. We might be able to get along with a few years. It would keep costs down, risks lower, again, temporarily. I think the political viability, the grant restrictions, and the emerging mandates would eventually, we'd run out of time on this, but we might be able to get a few years here. So it's buying time. The emissions are not that high now. They've actually, the technology is pretty good. And they may still get better, but it'll never get to zero. That's the problem with diesel, is that it will never, we'll hit a wall at some point and it'll just never get any lower. Okay, costs and funding. I'm gonna give you a little bit of what we have. I need to do a whole lot more work here with Dina and with Forrest when he gets back. But we do have preliminary financial modeling from the consultants, and they did give us some high-level estimates. We've begun working to refine those estimates and get more details. I need to work with my mechanics, and this goes back to staff engagement, which I know the board takes very seriously, and there's a monitoring report about that. I have promised the mechanics and technicians that I will get their input before I render a final recommendation to you. And it's not a hard promise because I really want it. This is way over my head. They want to get their arms into these new vehicles and really tell me what's it like, what they think about this. And I really want to hear it. So I need to give them time to do that. I've got to figure out how to get them to the vehicles or get the vehicles to them. We are presently working to get detailed cost estimates to convert the garage to both battery and hydrogen. I'm hedging my bets. We're gonna waste some money here, but it's good. We're gonna get detailed estimates because the facility upgrades are such a big factor. We're gonna have to go through the Ann Arbor Planning Commission. Discussions with staff suggest the changes to our building 3 to 5 months to talk to them about it. So I have to build that into my plan. I'm probably going to do that while you're talking, just so I don't lose any time on the back end. And the fire department. We had some good conversations with the fire chief. We need to have some more. And critically, we're going to need to really understand your priorities as best we can to come up with a capital plan that prioritizes this versus the other infrastructure and the services that we all want. Because there's a lot of different funding sources and they all have different strings attached to it. So there's actually a lot of Tetris game stuff on the back end to mix and match the grants to be the most optimum arrangement. Costs and funding. We should not have any illusions here that we're going to save money. I just want to be right up front about that. On the capital side, we're talking 50 to 75 million more than we're already spending over 25 years, which is 118-ish. So 50 to 75 on top of 118, it's a sizable increase. Now, a lot of this money we could get the feds to pay for. There's competitive grants. The problem with that is that we're talking about a 12 to 25-year transition period. There are going to be numerous presidential administrations, numerous Congress, different priorities, different grant programs. They may not all pay us the same amount of money. Some may not pay us any. The local share to match these federal investments is coming from that capital reserve. That's that money I was telling you we have to be very, very careful about. 50 to 75 million, based on a reasonable assumption about how much we might have to pay, we could easily exhaust the entire capital reserve on this one project and have nothing left for the YTC, the BTC, the garage, or bus rapid transit. So we have to be careful. One way about being careful is to go slow, to ramp it up, a couple of buses a year, and frankly, maybe buy a few diesel buses at the same time to keep replacement up. So it slows our transition on the back end. Maybe we're not done by 2038, maybe it's 2045. We're going to have to consider moving that in and out. On the operations side, the capital, frankly, I have greater confidence in the capital right now. The operations, this is where you get like a turducken of assumptions stacked on top of each other. A lot of the stuff on operations here revolves on the technology that may or may not exist in the future. the hydrogen supply lines that may or may not exist in the future. So we're getting into really guesswork here. There is a good possibility, and you can see this in the consultant's report, that we could lower our operating costs with these two technologies. The energy might cost less and the maintenance might cost less. Let's not forget that the driver is the number one expense, and that's not going to change. So we're talking about modest changes to some of those smaller contributors. But I have a little trouble under the assumptions about how much energy will cost in the future, 10, 15 years. It's really hard for me to prudently commit to you that I have confidence how much electricity or hydrogen is going to cost 10 years from now. We're just guessing, you know. Something that did come up in the discussions about this, it might have been board member Paulé, who's not here tonight. The idea of a kill switch built into this decision, where it could be, we will proceed under certain financial circumstances, but automatic shut off if those financial conditions are broken. When we bought hybrids years ago, we kept buying them even after we could not afford them any longer. So we kind of went too far on that one. To not repeat that mistake, we could create some sort of kill switch in this decision where, as long as it doesn't, cost more on operations than diesel does and doesn't disrupt the other capital projects too much, we will proceed. But an automatic shut off if it does. There are possibilities there. I had not considered it before. So, preliminary recommendation, the hydrogen technology we have today works. It seems to work better than batteries. There's less magical thinking or hope involved to make it happen. It could become zero emissions. We're going to have to get green hydrogen, or else it's just sort of incremental, but it's possible. It works better at a larger scale. There are fewer risks, fewer assumptions, less risk to the operating budget. There's still a real risk that we picked the Betamax that there's no way to know other than to take a knee and wait for this to sort of resolve itself. And a slower implementation is something that could lower the risks. But there's also ways to, go slow in the beginning, buy 2 buses a year and then accelerate the purchases on the back end so that we still get the full fleet transition by 2038, which is the number in my head right now. But when we do that, we have to be considering the second generation of replacements to those buses. We don't want to create a real spike in spending that 12 years later, we have a whole lot of buses we got to replace, and each one of them costs a whole lot more than we ever budgeted before. We need to be careful not to put ourselves in a corner by, we can get money now for the first generation of the technology, but then the feds don't help us pay for the second generation. We would be in a financial hole if we did that. Okay. Thanks for staying with me. Just a little more. Next steps. Staff have some work to do to really confirm, like I'm leaning towards hydrogen, but I still have to check with the mechanics. I need to get them to where they can touch this stuff, take it apart, put it back together, give me their best impressions. We need to develop detailed estimates, not just for the fleet, but for the buildings, and really sort of dig into the best we can on the fuel and energy supply chains. We got to work with the local planning commission to make sure there's nothing hiding in the weeds there. Hopefully there isn't. I got to get you better understanding of what this means for the overall capital plan. How does this affect the YTC, the garage, bus rapid transit? We need more time to sort that out, and we will continue to have discussions with you. We don't need to stay here all night if you don't want to this evening. Roughly speaking, again, I'm looking to that grant application in the spring of 2024, working backwards from that. I'd like to take January to March to prepare the grant application materials. I want to hit it out of the park, which means coming to you for some sort of decision October to December of this year. That would take the form of me making a very specific recommendation to you, with a recommendation to amend the capital budget, a recommendation to authorize the grant application, and a recommendation to adopt a transition plan. The transition plan is a federally funded federally required thing. It's basically our promise that we are going to do this. It seems to be a little loosey-goosey about the details, but nevertheless, we need to give them that or they don't give us any money for this. Okay. That's through my updates. We've gotten to the discussion time and what I want to suggest, what I think may be at the heart of the board for this matter. I don't think it's the technology, it's very meansy. But we have a limited amount of capital funds. We want to advance all our goals. We want to advance the long range plan, but we kind of want to advance this too. It's one of your goals. We need to do that. We might be able to split our funds, you know, maybe 90% here, 10% there, or 80-20, 75-25. Like there may be things we could do. And we could split staff focus to a degree. Troy and I have had some conversations about how can the maintenance department step up into doing this. George and I have had some very preliminary conversations. We can't split our focus on too many things, right? So we got to be careful. So the questions that come to me that I'd like to know from you is where do you guys stand on priorities for capital funding? This versus the infrastructure and services in the long range plan. I've guessed, you know, my starting assumption is that the propulsion is secondary to the infrastructure because the propulsion only advances one end and the infrastructure and services advance many of them. And increasing ridership also has environmental benefits. That's the only reason propulsion is secondary. It's just counting dots. That's the big one. What risk level are you comfortable with? Knowing that, you know, it's not guaranteed, success is not guaranteed. We may have to go slow to reduce the risk, but how do you feel about that? And this parallels very much the policy governance terms of what are we going to do, for whom, and at what cost. So with that, Madam Chair, I'm happy to answer whatever questions. It is my intent to bring you more specifics over the next few months, but happy to entertain any questions you may have now.
Before I open it up to the board, I have a quick question. You were very clear on, I believe you said it was 3-to-1 electric buses to diesel because electric buses cannot do a full day's run. So it would take 3 buses to do the work of 1. Is that what I heard?
I want to clarify. It can change. It's as clear as mud. So on the worst case, 3 years ago, it clearly was 1 to 3 when we started these conversations among staff. Since then, the technology has gotten better. Has it gotten down to 1 to 2 all the time? I don't know. It seems to have gotten close to that. And there are days on short routes and short runs where, yeah, it could be a 1-to-1 thing. I could deploy battery buses today on some of my shorter routes. The problem is that reduces the fleet's interoperability and harms our economies of scale. Suddenly I have buses that cannot do Route 4. They can only do the shorter routes. Ultimately, I will have to spend more operating dollars on staff to manage and stick handle these buses to make sure they don't go in the wrong place.
Can you share then? I don't remember you saying what the hydrogen, is it 1-to-1 for the hydrogen that one, or are we
It's much
still?
closer to 1-to-1.
Okay,
yes.
thank you. And now I'm going to open it. Thank you for allowing me to get that clarification before we open it up. So now we're going to open it up to the entire board for questions from Mr. Carpenter. I think you broke them.
It's late. It's late.
To be fair, it is very early in the discussion. You did present us with a lot of wonderful information. I know that I will be reading this packet and getting as much information as I can. I heard you say that your deadline for trying to write the grant proposal will be January through March of next year, that we will probably hear from you in October of this year with your final recommendation to us with regards to this. Between now and October, what can the board expect with regards to, will there be any follow-up meetings or information between now and October that you can foresee?
Oh, absolutely. This is a lot to digest and it's a very dense subject matter. My hope is when we get a little more stability on the staff side, we can crunch the numbers. That's the thing that's missing today is the hard and fast cost information to the best today's information can provide. I need to get that to you. As that comes in, I think I'll be able to give you updates where this stuff gets refined. As the mechanics come back from their junket or whatever we want to call it, I'll be able to tell you, what does the maintenance staff think? As we get closer, as we understand the costs, we can either get more certain about the hydrogen path or reconsider it, right? Like I have to leave the door open that, you know, maybe it is the batteries. We might hear something new in the next few months. I don't expect anything really from the planning commission. I think they're just going to have sort of like maybe plant some shrubs or something. I don't know what they're going to tell me, but I don't think it's going to be monumental. But it could increase costs. But that's just going to get plugged into that. Then we're going to have to come back and tell you how are we going to pay for this and everything else we won't want it to do. That's, I think, the big thing, and that's your priorities right there. As we pull this information together, I would like to come back to you with updates periodically between now and October. My thinking is we'll try to get this stuff done, but by September, leaving the door clear for budget. You got something else to deal with in September. And then coming to you after that with this information seems like the best timing right now. But absolutely, I'd love to come back, particularly if you'd like to discuss even this level and give me your thoughts on priorities and risk tolerance. I think that's what I need to hear from you guys.
I'm going to say, oh, Rich, okay, then go ahead, Monica.
Well, thank you for the presentation. Yes, that I'm more of the risk tolerance aspect of it in regards to actual return on investment. That is a big question for me. And I know we're going to talk more about this, obviously, going forward. My concerns are there's a push to the technology that hasn't been proven yet. And so there may be a lot of money that's spent on technology, which I understand why it has to be done because of the grant applications and how they're positioning the applications to move forward to the technology. However, yeah, I heard you mention fail safe. Just say everything changes in 2020, I don't know, 2035, right? Then there's a lot of money that's been spent. And the question is it actually going to be cost savings at all in the end? And so those are the questions that I have in regards to the risk tolerance and the return on investment, if any. I look forward to having those continual discussions.
If I might just provide a quick response. One of the things that I'm struggling with is in our consultant's report, it does suggest cost savings on an operational level for both of these technologies. Okay, it's good. There's assumptions piled up. But then I go talk to my peers who are actually running these technologies. And one of the foremost people who's doing this, he's made some great observations. He just flat out said, don't tell your board you're saving money. That's not why we're doing this. And I think we should all just expect this is going to cost more. It's going to cost more to buy and it's going to cost more to run. Decarbonizing our economy is not going to be cheap. We get so much out of fossil fuels because we just dump stuff into the air. We don't have to worry about it. To internalize those costs. There's no way to do that at the same price. Like it's just not going to happen. So we're not doing this because it's cheap. If we save money, great. I don't see, it hasn't been proved to my satisfaction yet. We do it because it's the right thing to do, because it needs to be done. But there is a question of trade-offs that has to be grappled with.
Rich.
Thanks. Yeah. So what Monica said actually mirrors a lot of like how I was approaching this, but then I also understand where Matt's coming from. Of just like it does cost us money to achieve some of these ends that we have. And I go to I hate to bring this back up, but like ends 1.1.1, which talks about affordable transportation options. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I was going through and I just did quick math. I think like for this year, we're expecting about 6 million in revenue from fares. And I look at when I hear terms like we have 103 buses. And when I did the quick math, like they say that the batteries, it's 700K to 1.2 million per bus. And a fuel cell, it's 1 million to 1.5. So just say an average of 1 million. If we go through and we actually end up saying like, okay, well, we want to replace our entire fleet. I mean, that's $103 million potentially that we're going to spend on. Like granted, there are options like grants or whatever that we could get some funding on that. But I sit there and go like, is there ways that actually we can drive our actual ridership? Because I mean, in the end, I would be very much for this if our buses, especially on our busiest routes, were fully utilized. And we aren't there now. And I think we can say it's because of COVID, but I don't even know. And I'm not saying because I have the data or the facts in my head. I don't even know if we were even if we're at that level before COVID. And maybe we were, and actually that's, I think, some helpful data for me too, I guess, for me to kind of make an informed decision on that. But right now, I just have a really tough view of this, but I'm really looking forward to the further discussion, especially once you get more financial information for us to consider.
And if I might, part of that financial information is we're going to end up spending $118 million replacing the diesel buses over the next 25 years anyway. Some of that money can be shifted over here. So your math is not going to say close because I don't know what close is. But the idea, there are savings, there are grants, there are things we can shift around, and there's a lot of strings attached to different funding sources. And I'm sure Dina can help us sort of mix and match them to the optimum degree. But at the end of the day, yeah, we're talking about paying more for something that in and of itself is not going to attract any more people to the service.
Mr. Carpenter, Mike Alamang has his hand raised. Go ahead, Mike.
Yes, Matt, thank you for a very, very enlightening presentation. I have a few questions. I suspect other people do too, but I am also very reluctant to ask them at 10 o'clock in the evening. I'm just wondering if when there will be the next opportunity to maybe digest this a little bit more and have an opportunity to ask questions that maybe we're thinking about tonight and won't ask, and the questions that may come up tomorrow that we didn't think about tonight.
I do my best thinking as I'm nodding off to sleep, and that's usually when I lose.
Well, good for you, man.
I would be happy to come back to you in the committee meetings and add this to committee meeting agendas for discussion. I'll return to the board meeting next month and just as a follow-up to this and be like, okay, you had a month to digest that, maybe read the report. And then Mike that might be a better time when everyone's had a little more rest. Might make sense.
Yep. Next board meeting would be good, I would think, because first of all, I think it's best to have the board interaction, not just do it in segments with committees. But that sounds good to me anyway.
Mike, that was a really good question that you raised. And I think that might be the best way for us to move forward rather than do it in small increments in committees where there may be some very good questions generated to help with thought processes that someone in finance may think of that somebody in service may not get or understand. So I think bringing it back to the full board after we've had a time to think about tonight's presentation, maybe rewatch it and then take a look at this wonderful information that you've provided us with this evening. I think that might be best. Justin, were you?
Yeah, and my main questions have to do with I guess, risk, but more risk to the long range plan. We spent years working on it with lots of public engagement, and zero emission buses was not a huge priority. It wasn't like not a priority, but the main priority of the traveling public was service related. And our entire long range plan is geared around service. So I'm going to need a lot of information about how this plan affects, how zero emission buses affect a long range plan. Because in terms of like risk tolerance, I've, personally have a low tolerance of risk to the long range plan. I don't want to wait till 2045 for all that stuff anyway. I'm kind of making do. So if you're telling me that's going to push everything off to 2055, I need to know in order to make a good decision on that.
If I might follow up, if I could give you a proposal that answers that question, and says maybe modest delay to long range plan stuff, but it allows us to get started on the zero emissions path. We may not finish that path, right away, but it allows us to get started. But it doesn't, maybe something is delayed, the infrastructure is delayed a year or two. Would that be in the realm of something you might be willing to consider?
I think it would really depend. I've been waiting for the YTC for 4 years
Good
already.
point.
So give me I'll need a little bit more. I look forward to that proposal.
All right.
All right, if there are no other questions for Mr. Carpenter, we can go ahead and close this out. Thank you for everything. Thank you for the staff, and I am most appreciative to hear how you are including the maintenance staff in this discussion. I look forward to hearing their feedback as well. It's very important. Now that we've wrapped that up, it sort of leads into the CEO report. Matt, did you want to pick some highlights from your report?
Just a few more hours. The report's pretty self-explanatory. We did have a question from the board at the last meeting about whatever happened to that triennial review. Happy to report everything is closed out. We had a little celebration party. The FTA is satisfied. So all dots dotted, all T's crossed. You may have noticed some new signage going up on some bus stop poles with some QR codes. Please check it out. It's a new Text My Bus. Find out when the next buses are riding customer service initiative. Thank you to the community relations and facilities staff and IT who've been working on that. I think that's about the only things I would update.
Thank you for that. That takes us into emergent items. Do we have any emergent items that we need to address this evening? All right, finally, closing items, action item recap, and topics for next meeting. I have topics for next meeting, ends follow up with Rose Mercier if that is available to us. That depends on her bandwidth. Also that you will come back to us and we'll start continuing the discussion on propulsion. I see that we have 2.10 communications and support to the board, 2.5 financial conditions, and 4.0 to 4.4 board management delegation policies. I'd like to remind everyone, I think the deadline for that is tomorrow at noon, and we've only heard from 4 members. So it's really important. That's not staff driven. That's how we're doing our job. What about those policies is helpful? What is not working? What is your perspective about how we are doing our job? So it's really super important that we get that. I understand that we have 2 new members and we are a member short. But I would hopefully like to get a couple more people in there for feedback. Matt, did I miss anything?
The only one that I had comes back to the procurements, a request for an email reminder out about volunteers and what it would take. So we'll get that sent out and that tomorrow.
Sounds great. Did you want me to send that email or were you going to have staff send it out? Okay, and then Mike has his hand raised again. Mike?
It was just the next meeting, we're going to talk about the construction policy again.
Yes. Thank you, Mike. And then will there be any further ownership linkage at the next meeting, or monitoring task force will probably report out again next meeting as well, correct, Mike?
Correct.
Okay, and then Rich, will you need, okay, so then Matt will have to add those as well. All right. If that's everything, I We will move on to public comment. Is there anyone in the wings there this late at night?
No, there's no public comment.
Okay, very good. So we are adjourned.